Okay, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, so please take your seats. We are ready to start the second day. So welcome everybody to the second day of this event. My name is Jukka Pirttilä. I'm with the University of Helsinki and also part of the UNU-WIDER research network. I collaborate with UNU-WIDER researchers in a tax research program for the institute. So today we start off with a session which presents the Financial Sustainable Development Report, and the speaker is Shari Spiegel, who's the chief of the Policy Analysis and Development Branch, Financial Sustainable Development Unit at UNDESA. So she will be presenting the report, and then we have a discussant, our own Amina Ebrahim, who's a research fellow at UNU-WIDER. Shari will speak about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion by Amina, and then we'll open the floor for the overall discussion. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much, and thanks for having us here to present this report. So I want to tell you a little bit about the report first. It's a unique report in that the report is not just UNDESA leads the report, but actually more than 60 agencies contribute to the report. So for those of you who don't know it, right before the 2030 agenda was agreed on and the SDG summit, there was another agreement called the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was an agenda on financing for sustainable development. And our office is meant to follow up on that agreement. And that includes several follow-up processes, including a Financing for Development Forum every year. And then we were told to put together this report every year. When I first was told I had to lead a task team to write one report with the entire international system, I was horrified. But it turns out that it's actually quite interesting and sort of fun. We work very closely with the IMF, World Bank, WTO, and then within the UN system, UNCTAD and UNDP. But we also work with every other UN agency, and then non-UN agencies, the OECD Secretariat, and to balance that, the South Center, and the Financial Stability Board is part of this. And as you can see, we cover the entire Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which includes 7 chapters. So it's domestic, the 3 on the left, domestic resource mobilization, private finance, and development cooperation are the big financing flows. And then on the other side are the sort of big systemic issues of debt, trade, systemic issues with stability of the financial system, and then technology and capacity development. So our report actually covers all of those chapters. We start with an update on the global economic context, and then we have a thematic chapter every year, and then we cover those chapters. So the 2022 report was on bridging the financing gap, the finance gap. And there. So I'm going to give a little bit of background. One of the interesting things, similar to the World Bank report we heard from yesterday, our report was the timetable we work on is we have to get it done. The report becomes the basis of country negotiations for the Financing for Development Forum. So we have to get it done by the end of February, even though we publish it in April. That means that the report was basically done before the Ukraine war started. So, and then we had 6 weeks when the world changed dramatically. The year before, that happened with COVID. The world changed dramatically between the time we finished the report and it went to print. And this time, the world changed dramatically again. And since it's been published, of course, the world has changed even more. But to start with, it was clear that there are interlinked crises that are putting the SDGs out of reach. And the idea was that we need a large investment push for climate action and the SDGs, and of course also at the time for responding to the COVID crisis. So those 3 different places that I listed are the 3 parts of sustainable development. So the way that it's defined in the UN. So the first is the social side, and that was really important, particularly social protection issues following the crisis and the COVID crisis. The second is the climate, the longer-term environmental and climate issues. And the third is the economic pillar, which is productive investment. And the idea behind the thinking is that if you have productive investment, not only can it lead to, if it's invested in the right way, development and climate impacts, it also should lead to growth. and therefore create fiscal capacity to be able to service debt better in the future. So I think yesterday somebody made the comment that debt's not bad and debt can be good, and that's sort of the underlying thinking that was going on, is that in order to achieve this big financing push, debt is needed, but it can be good if it's used in the right way. And it can be good if it's sustainable, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So that was sort of the idea behind it, but the pandemic revealed that there is a great finance, what we call the great finance divide. And basically it's very simple. Rich countries were able to finance the recovery, and poor countries didn't have the resources to either finance the recovery from COVID or to invest in sustainable development. And so you can see the first three icons are sort of those big financing flows. The second question is that all of those issues, of course, the financing gaps were exacerbated by liquidity, debt, and trade issues. And there was sort of the risk of the near-term crises, and then the questions of how do you deal with the longer-term systemic solutions. So that's sort of the overarching structure of what the report was doing. Of course, since the publication of the report, the environment has become even more challenging. The truth is that everything we highlighted just became more so. So I guess the biggest change was that inflation became a much bigger issue than it was before. And of course, that's an enormous challenge for policymakers when you have inflation together with slow growth. But from our side, and from thinking of it from the side of developing countries, and we talked about this a lot yesterday, the fact that interest rates are rising and there are weakening exchange rates has enormous implications and spillovers for developing countries. So we've seen $70 billion in capital outflows this year so far, and financial market volatility and an increasing risk of debt distress. So the first bullet is the bullet we all discussed yesterday. Actually, the numbers that people gave yesterday was 60% of countries. I think as of August, based on the IMF World Bank debt sustainability analysis, the number's actually gone down to 50%. In part, I think because commodity exporters have actually, some of them are not in debt distress anymore that were earlier. But the second piece of that is that, and we say this when we talk to developing countries a lot, is that the volatility we see in sovereign debt markets and the volatility of capital flows is just reflective of the greater volatility of financial markets that we're seeing right now. It's just that when you think about sovereign debt, it suddenly affects budgets and payments and health and all sorts of basic issues. So there's real questions, and this was slightly mentioned yesterday, of leverage in the system. We've been through a period of such low interest rates that there's a question of how levered the financial system is and how that's going to be delevering. And that's the non-bank financial institutions, questions of fintech that have been actually intermediating credit but are outside of the financial system. And so questions of how much volatility we're going to see as some of this deleveraging happens as interest rates rise. And then, of course, the other issue that we've been looking at for a long time are non-economic risks. Those are climate-related shocks, disasters, et cetera. And underlying all of our work is the interlinkages between those. So, and it's something that I think has changed a lot, that 5 or 10 years ago, if you tried to talk with economists about how these non-economic impacts are impacting the economics and how they should be incorporated into economic analysis, you would have gotten a blank face. And I think now there's more and more thinking about how do we incorporate these non-economic factors and how do they change the way we're thinking about some economic outcomes. So let's go, but going back to the report, the first point is, and this is what I mentioned before, is that developed countries were able to finance at large scale the response to COVID. I think everyone knows this. But yet only 3.5% of their country revenue was spent on servicing debt. Developing countries, it was more constrained, and that's because of limited fiscal space. The first point is on taxes. And we have a lot of tax experts here, so I stuck that point into, but it's basically that the taxes, as you can see in LDCs, is significant. That's the UN term for least developed countries, is significantly less than the tax received in developed countries. And at the same time, there were rising expenditures and social protection needs. And then finally, so you have the revenues were low and expenditures were going up. And of course, the other piece of all of this is the high debt servicing. So the poorest countries are dedicating 14% of their revenue to debt servicing. And when you look at some of the small island developing states that were not eligible for DSSI, they, on average, were paying 40% of their revenues in debt servicing. So there's a case where, rather than investing or being able to invest in the recovery, these countries were actually cutting spending in education, infrastructure, and other areas when following the COVID crisis. So this is all prior to the Ukraine war, and you can see some of the data. In particular, that in addition to poverty increasing, that there was already forecast that GDP per capita of 1/5 of developing countries wasn't going to reach 2019 levels by the end of 2023, and now those numbers are probably worse than they were. So just to say that, just to give an idea of what we were looking at, and this great finance divide that was sort of identified in the report. So going first to domestic resource mobilization, what this graph does is it just adds up prior to the crisis, prior to COVID, how many countries and the number of countries that were getting, for example, between 0 and 2% increase their tax revenue by 0 to 2%, or 2 to 4%, or more than 4%, or negative. And I think the interesting thing is that even though on average, in most countries, the majority actually increased revenues slightly, the amounts are very, very low. And they're nowhere near the amounts that would be needed to finance the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs with public finance, with domestic resource mobilization. So if you look, some of the numbers that of course, during the crisis, this got worse. So tax to GDP ratios declined in 72% of countries, but that revenue to GDP was below 15%, which is somehow considered an informal threshold in 76 countries after the pandemic. And basically, to get to the points we need much higher numbers than 4% a year. So the main point is simply that that this tax and domestic resource mobilization and the reforms to raise tax revenue, including international cooperation, international tax cooperation, are really important, but they're a long-term project. And they're not going to be able to solve the problem in the near term, and yet given the crises we're seeing, we need funding in the near term. So this is a really important component, but and it needs to start now, or to continue now, but it's not something that's going to happen in the near term to solve the problems, to address the crises we're seeing. This is going back to the debt issue, just to show, it's just a graph that shows the amount of financing, the amount of budget financing that is going to finance interest payments in some of the, and you can see that in the poorest countries, the LDCs, and also in SIDS, the amount is just really high of the budget. So, and this was all prior to the war, and one more graph on this. So, the reason, if you look at the left-hand side, you'll see this is just showing the left-hand piece is just showing figuratively the same issue, that the green bar is the amount of money that countries were able to spend to respond to the crisis, and you can see that it's positive for the developed countries and middle-income countries, and almost non-existent for the poorest countries. The poorest countries did have a benefit from DSSI, which you can see in the negative red there, but that is, of course, ending. And in fact, if you looked at the upcoming payments, debt servicing in 2023 and 2024, it's going to start spiking, in part because the DSSI numbers are now going to be compounded going out. And so the other piece of this that's interesting is that prior to the war, you can see in the last graph that credit spreads had started increasing, but there was still a gap. So the medium emerging market country was still able to borrow relatively cheaply. But it was only the 75 percentile that you saw this enormous gap between the borrowing costs. Now that has changed. So credit spreads, sovereign bond yields are now over 10% for over 20 countries, and capital markets have effectively dried up for at least 54 developing countries. So we're starting to look and to think a little bit about the cost of borrowing, because one of the questions is, how do countries, and how can, if we can't look to domestic resource mobilization as a solution, the second question is, well, we said at the beginning that debt is not bad, but that's only if you grow enough to compensate, grow more than the debt, than the cost of the borrowing. So if the cost of borrowing is really expensive, you're never going to be able to grow your way out of the debt, of the borrowing, and so you can more likely run into a debt crisis. So, but one of the interesting things that we looked at, and we did some work on this actually with Ugo, though some of his work did not make it into the report. As I said, we work with 60 agencies, and everybody has to agree on everything. And one of the agencies that's in this room crossed out Ugo's box. but the work that's here is actually the flip side that did make it into the report, is the flip side of the same story. And the point is that sovereign borrowing has historically been very expensive. So since 1995, even after you net out defaults, the investors have actually earned 6 percentage points above the risk-free rate on investing in sovereign bonds. And that's even after you account for any defaults. And basically, they have been the best performing asset class compared to equities, compared to corporate bonds, compared to any other asset class. If you invested in emerging markets over this long period of time, you actually did really, really well. And that's even after adjusting for volatility. So what that means is that developing countries who are borrowing on capital markets are paying a very, very high price for borrowing that goes beyond their what's actually implied by their credit. And yet, this has been a continuous story, so the question of how you can actually address that and reduce that spread is not easy. But so that's basically sort of the story of the great financing divide that we were sort of looking at when we looked at the report. And then we start thinking about what are the solutions. And as I said, we have to cover all of these topics. So we're looking at issues with tax, we're looking at private finance, development cooperation, trade, debt, systemic issues, and technology. So we're covering a huge amount of information in trying to do this. And so I've summarized some of the ideas here. And I'm not going to go into all of them, just looking at the time, because it would be, but I'm going to just go and talk about a few of them. So the first idea, and this actually is the idea that is development cooperation, an old idea. And in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, development banks was actually brought up and was at the core of the thinking of how do you finance sustainable development, even back in 2015. Now it's the first time, I think, that the international community is actually thinking about this in a serious way. Though at the time of the agreement, it was actually a basis, and not just the MDBs. Also public development banks, national development banks, such as KfW, national development banks that lend across borders, but also domestic national development banks. And so the first set of recommendations are, first of all, on ODA, and in particular on grants, but as we discussed yesterday, there's limited grant financing, and we don't know that that's going to actually increase. The second is to think about strengthening the system of development banks. So there's a lot of work going on how do you strengthen the MDBs, with the G20 capital adequacy framework work of how do you better use capital. Actually, the Addis Agenda was the first place that called for that called for using capital more effectively, for MDB capital more effectively. And then also, obviously, in terms of recapitalization. But it goes beyond just thinking about the MDBs. So the recommendation then says that we need to look at public development banks more broadly, and how does the system of public development banks work closely together? When are there opportunities for co-financing, for risk-sharing mechanisms across the system, as well as from learning, particularly there are no question that there are governance issues, et cetera, at some national development banks. But nonetheless, they also have a lot of national information. And is there a way to better utilize and better leverage some of that information and at the same time as doing capacity development? So that's one set of recommendations. It's like we need additional finance, and there's a system that's set up to do that. The other interesting thing, the other interesting thing about the using the national development banks in particular is that when we think about, well, a government is borrowing, and yet they don't have a balance sheet. So we start trying to figure out, we're looking at income statements all the time to try to evaluate whether a government can repay its debt or not. And so we don't know where the money's going. At the very beginning of the discussion, the main point that was discussed in our task force was it depends on how the money's used. We've seen countries borrow a lot, and they borrowed a lot in the 2000s, and it didn't necessarily lead to growth. And so there's a big question of how the money is used as to whether debt's going to actually have a positive impact on growth and sustainable development. And so if you can ring fence where the money is going into an institution that is financially sustainable and that has good governance, then you are able to see the asset and liability side next to each other. So this idea of thinking about looking at a development bank or some sort of institution that has assets and liabilities is a way to begin to think about how do we measure and think about the impact of where the money is going. So that's the first set of recommendations. Okay, the second set of recommendations is let's try to reduce that big spread on capital markets. Now that's really hard. The most obvious thing is actually national actions. So you reduce risk in your country and clearly your credit spread goes down. So that's the first recommendation, and that's all throughout the report, is something that is a big old discussion of how do you actually reduce risk and increase your enabling and improve your enabling environment. At the same time, efforts to reduce global volatility. But these are old discussions. That's in our systemic chapter, and we know that we're not getting there, though there are discussions that have been on for a long time. The second set of issues that we looked at were issues related to credit ratings and debt sustainability assessments. Again, the report, there are big debates about this in the task force. Some of the task force members did not really like to talk about this too much. So what's in the report is less than the really fascinating conversations we had outside of the report in the analysis going into the report, the analysis behind the report. But one of the issues is that credit ratings, as well as the DSAs, don't really distinguish between liquidity and solvency. So what a DSA is doing, a debt sustainability analysis, is it's running lots of simulations to say, if we, over different stimulations, if you keep borrowing, what is the path of your interest payments? And does the path level off, or does the path go up and compound to a place that's unsustainable? And so that's based on a set of assumptions that go into that model. And is there a way to say, well, what if we actually had long-term cheaper funding from the international system? Does that change the debt sustainability analysis? So this question of thinking about what we can call a long-term DSA or a long-term credit rating, or you could think about it as looking at liquidity versus solvency issues, is can we have better tools? Because if it's really a liquidity crisis only, then somebody should be willing to lend. But it's very, very difficult to distinguish between when it is and when it isn't. But can we improve our tools to be able to try to do that better? And then the final point under that was to use the growing interest in sustainability. We talked a lot about this in the past yesterday. So can we use growing interest in green bonds, et cetera, to reduce borrowing costs? So far, that hasn't reduced borrowing costs. But can it be done maybe through sustainability-linked bonds, et cetera? And that was discussed and presented yesterday as well. The next point, which I'm not going to go into in much detail, is resetting financial markets. The second bullet of that is a lot of the issues of sustainability reporting, which I think will be discussed later this afternoon. But well, we can talk about it in the questions and answers if people want to, because I don't think there's time to go into it in such detail. But we're also look at a lot of the questions about companies that report on their sustainability. How can we do it in ways that are more accurate? How can we do it in ways that are consistent across different company reporting? And then questions of how do you verify or assess the credibility of those numbers, as well as the credibility of things like sustainability ratings. Because right now, the same company is rated high and low by different rating sustainability raters. And one of the questions is, when we think about credit ratings, our traditional credit ratings, it's based on audited financial statements. So you can look at the credit rating, but you can also go back and look at the audited financial statement. Or if it's based for a sovereign, you have some information that you can look at yourself. With sustainability, that it's really a black box. We don't know what the sustainability raters are using, and we also don't really have very good information for the incoming information, which is very subjective as well. So it's a very tricky place, but it's also a new place where there's new thinking going on. And then the next question was on issues of liquidity and the global financial safety net, whether we should have more in questions related to SDRs. The more systemic issuance of SDRs is not in the report, again, but it is a question that there has been discussion on. Some people have been calling for regular issuance of SDRs, and we've begun to think about what about counter-cyclical issuance of SDRs, and can the international system begin to explore ways that could be done more efficiently. Finally, the question is to urgently address the risk of a debt crisis. That would be a long discussion, but that's been going on now all day, yesterday for this whole conference. But I would just say that and again, the report was written at a different time and it talks a lot about issues with the common framework. So I'm stepping away from the report a little bit, and the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General, is talking about this now. He called for what he called the DSSI expanded. But the idea is that the main thinking, I think, is that there is a high risk of a solvency crisis happening across countries, and the international community is just not ready to address it. We don't have a system in place to address it if there is a systemic crisis. And so the community should be thinking now to have something in its back pocket ready if something happens. And the world has changed a lot since HIPC, et cetera, or the Brady bonds. But nonetheless, there are tools that we know of that can be used in the event of a crisis, but no one's really thinking about it seriously. And so it's time to really begin to think about, if there is a crisis, how do we respond to it? And particularly this question of coordination across creditor classes. So if we have an official sector-led process, how do we bring in the private sector into the official sector process? And you need to have a concrete mechanism to do that. And again, the report doesn't say this so explicitly. This is going on. This is more work that's been done more recently, but and they're thinking that's happening now. But can you use carrots and sticks to try to incentivize private sector participation in official discussions? So finally, I just went back to some of the issues on the countryside, and including the issue of domestic resource mobilization and medium-term revenue strategies. And I put on this discussion of integrated national financing frameworks, which we don't have time to discuss, so we'll just skip that for now. And the final thing I wanted to say is that every year, as I said, we have a new topic, a new thematic chapter, and governments guide us in thinking about what that chapter should be. So this year, the chapter for next year is actually on what yesterday you called green sustainable, green industrial policies. We're thinking of it as sustainable industrial policies. But what does that mean? What can we learn from historical cases, successes and failures? And then how has it changed and how is it different today, given the new components of climate and sustainability that need to be thought in. So that's sort of where we as a system are looking into for the next year's report. So thank you so much. I know I covered a lot of information as the report does, so I hope it was helpful, clear. Thanks.
Thank you, Shari, so much for the wide covering presentation. And now we move on to the discussant. Amina, please.
Okay, so thanks, Shari. So I have this task of discussing a report that's more than 200 pages long. So I'll pick out some of the key messages and then I'll try and link it to some of the work that we do at UNU-WIDER. So this is a really rich, informative report, and it really emphasizes this widening gap in financing for sustainable development. And this really pull and push between these rich and poor countries. So my three main takeaways really was that the cost of debt was really crippling, debt financing is really crippling for developing countries, and it's really made it difficult in the recovery of COVID-19. Rich countries are able to support their recovery, and this is in part due to this high borrowing, but then also at ultra low or very low interest rates. And then poor countries are spending billions in servicing debt, and this actually really hampers this investment in sustainable development. So for developed countries, they were able to respond much better to the pandemic, and part of this is about the ability to mobilize their resources locally, and then also it's about stronger political and economic institutions that they could actually negotiate their response to the pandemic, and you can think about the vaccine discussion there. And then developing countries, my own country, South Africa, we struggle a lot in the fiscal space, and then thinking about how we were going to repay debts. So my three main comments, and these are not really, again, it's quite challenging to, comment on a comprehensive report, but these are maybe some less maybe comments, but more some of, the things that I took away from for my own work. So the first one is the comment on special drawing rights, and as a tool for to address systemic risk. The taking action on debt, so this is sort of where Shari was going towards the end of her presentation. And then some of the revenue mobilization challenges and opportunities. So there are many challenges, but I think our work has also shown that there are some opportunities to increase revenue. So we know that debt to GDP ratios were already high before the pandemic, and it's just been exacerbating the risk of debt distress. And then special drawing rights were provided to countries to boost liquidity and combat the pandemic effects. But some countries use them in different ways. Some were using them to pay their debts, while others were using them for government spending. And so we think, one comment is, while SDRs are maybe a welcome boost, they probably can't shoulder the big burden of bouncing back from the pandemic, and so more might need to be done in that space. And then SDRs are maybe meant to complement rather than substitute other financing channels. My second thinking was around the sort of uneven or not level playing field. And so Shari had this really nice graph, and it's in the report of the different areas of debt stocks and servicing costs. And so it was clear there that debt stocks for developed countries increased, and this peaked in 2019, 2020, but servicing costs were reduced. Middle or MICs saw the sticky increase, and then they had this service cost kind of U-shaped, so it goes down and then it comes back up again. The LDCs have low debt shocks or debt stocks when compared to the developed countries, but their debt servicing costs are then comparably higher, and the SIDs almost never have access then to capital markets, and so they rely on this non-concessional and short-term expensive debt. Now the increase in service costs may be a reflection of reduced resource or domestic revenue, and increased access to non-concessional debt, and the increased use of more short-term expensive debt is in this discussion. Some of this can be explained by the structure and the nature of economies in these countries, and where there's some more difficulties emphasized in some of the middle-income countries. So this is really where, I guess our work in WIDER comes into the discussion. So many developing countries have many domestic revenue mobilization challenges. Weakness in revenue management, tax exemptions, many tax exemptions, sometimes unclear tax exemptions, And then shortfalls in the capacity of the revenue authorities and the customs administration to actually draw in the revenue that might actually be there. But all is not lost. There is still potential to mobilize more taxes, and specifically we work in African economies. And so some of the thinking around this is looking at better tax administration, thinking through broadening the tax base. And here I'm not just thinking about bringing in more and more firms or individuals into the tax base, but actually looking at tax compliance and that maybe plugging the holes on tax loopholes. And then our work is mostly around using tax data. So I've got tax data for revenue. And what do I mean by this? Really, a lot of our work's around using tax data to analyze and provide some knowledge for policy making and inclusive development. And some of our work is around looking at compliance and how to increase compliance and mitigate some of the potential effects of taxation for enterprise growth and job creation. And of course, improving capacities for tax and other domestic revenue mobilization is actually a key target for SDG 17. So thank you.
Thank you, Amina. Shari, do you have immediate thoughts on the basis of what Amina said, or do we want to take?
Let's open.
Yes. All right. So now it's time for questions, comments from the audience. So we can gather a couple of ones, and then we'll give the opportunity for Shari to respond. So there's one in the back, at the back. Okay, there.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, and I will be kind of focusing on one particular question. That is, you said that is the premium that the developing countries pay, risk premium, is about 6%, right? But that's on an average, right? So there must be some countries, 4%, the others are kind of, say, 8% and something like that. So one, perhaps, a direct mode of action that could be kind of just taken. Suppose, just make a comparative study for the two countries with very similar characteristics, like, almost even having a shared border or something. And if one country pays, say, substantively less premium than the other, then, you can, some sort of a randomized trial, you can kind of point out, like, what could be the possible, actions that the government could take. For example, one could kind of go to even more specific in the sense that, say, the debt investors, all they care, the premium is coming from the default premium and nothing else, right? Because the payment is fixed, so only what they care is the default premium, So what countries probably have done something to get a less default premium than the other. So my question is, are there any kind of research or any kind of work done in this kind of a setting?
Okay, thanks for that. Then there was a second one. If we move from the back to the front, yes, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for 2 great presentations. A question to Shari. It's maybe just factual. I didn't quite follow the numbers on the debt service ratio when we talk about unsustainable debt. Is that what kind of debt service ratio as a percent of GDP or revenue are we talking about? And when is it? And maybe that's from when is it? How severe is the crisis now? Is the debt service ratios in our own countries, rich countries, is much higher? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that to understand that better.
And then I saw at least, yes, the lady to the left. And then we pause and give Shari a possibility to respond. Please go ahead.
Shari, the last question, one of the points you made was about, there's a possible debt crisis coming and we're not prepared. And you mentioned carrots and sticks. Given the common framework, one of the big barriers has been the comparability of treatment, the fact that creditors should share the burden equally. what that hasn't been able to be operationalized or enforced? What do you think is the remedies for that?
Right, okay.
Yeah,
So-
please.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So 3 questions. So in the first question, I mean, the best, there are 2 separate issues. The first issue is that the credit spread reflects the probability of default and the expectation of what the recovery value would be in a default. So, though of course, if it really reflected that correctly, you wouldn't see the asset class, the total asset class, all of them combined, outperforming other asset classes. It would be around the same when you adjust for volatility. So there's some extra premium in there for whatever reason, which could be something as simple as an uncertainty premium, because it could be that it doesn't necessarily mean that markets are mispricing it. They could be just pricing something like uncertainty or something into that premium. So the first thing is countries should be able to can reduce their credit spreads, and they do that by improving their fundamentals as the market looks at fundamentals. Now, the problem is, of course, that markets look at very short-term oriented fundamentals, so that it's not looking at a long-term, it's not necessarily aligned with long-term development, it's more aligned with short-term fiscal space. And so they're looking for very specific things. Can you repay me in the next year? And what numbers do I need to evaluate that? But given that, there are things countries can do to reduce the risk of default based on how investors evaluate countries. And so that's one thing. And many of those things are good for development. Some of them are not as closely aligned as we would like. So that's the first thing. And so you can look at different countries that have reduced their credit spreads, because countries have, and see how they've done it and how it aligns with the improvements and the reforms that they've made and development in their countries. So, and then there's this other question of, can we systemically try to reduce some of the systemic cost? And that's a lot harder. It's been there for a long time. And it may have to do with uncertainty. It may have to do with the fact we don't have a sovereign debt restructuring, a clean way to restructure sovereign debt. So nobody really knows what recovery values will be. So there are a lot of reasons that could be behind why that gap is so big. So then in the second question was on, I wasn't writing it down. Right, on debt service ratios. Okay, good, thank you. Jet lagged and not writing things down doesn't work. Right, so there isn't any one number or ratio you can look at. It depends on the country. And clearly developed countries are able to sustain much higher debt ratios than poorer countries are. So you do have these debt sustainability analyses. You also have credit ratings, which are trying to figure out, or trying to, in a sense, estimate the debt sustainability analysis, how sustainable is the debt for this country, given this country's ability to service its debt, given a whole bunch of inputs that go into thinking about it. So based on those analyses, I think it's 50% of low-income countries are at risk, are in or at high risk of debt distress. And so I don't know if that answers the question, but that's right, because it's not, there's no one number to look at. Yeah?
There were numbers on the slide.
Uh-huh. Okay. On the slide with the different charts, the 4. All right. So those were just looking at the debt service, how much of fiscal spending, of revenues, how much of revenues is going to service debt. And it was breaking it down by developed countries, by middle-income countries, and by SIDS and LDCs. And you could see that even though developed country debt was going up, the debt servicing cost was very low for developed countries, in part because interest rates were so low. But that because low-income countries actually, you could see that debt actually went down in the beginning of in the early 2000s due to HIPC and MDRI, but then debt starts going back up again. And as more and more low-income countries and LDCs are accessing markets, the cost goes up, because as long as they were getting most of their money from official borrowing, then it was very, very low cost of borrowing. But as they were accessing markets, you can see the cost of their borrowing jumping up. And then SIDS, it's always been quite high, so that it's been relative to revenue, and then middle-income countries are somewhere in between. So that was those 4 things. I just looked at the revenue to interest costs, interest payments to revenue. And then the final question, sorry? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, that's we're at the point where we can't even get the official creditors to agree. So that's not, we're not in at least to do it quickly in a timely manner. So, and then the second question is, how do you bring in cross-creditor classes, which is even harder? So, so one can think about, and there are proposals out there of mechanisms. You can use sweeteners. You can use sticks. So one thing is you can use sweeteners and some guarantees. So you say we're going to restructure and have some sort of a guarantee on the payment from an official sector guarantee, something like has been done in the past. And at the same time, you can try to say that anyone who doesn't participate will become less senior, will be stuck with the old bonds, which will become less senior. So you can try to find ways to both incentivize participation and also at the same time make it the old bonds not as good. But there are other mechanisms that are out there. There are other ideas that are out there similar to HIPIC that can be used to do that. And Ugo just left because he will know this even better than I do. Yeah.
Thank you. There's still room for additional comments, questions. So I see at least 2 hands. Martti, please.
Thank you, and thank you for a very good presentation. I was thinking about the point on liquidity versus solvency issue, and I think it's very important. And the current situation is telling sort of a story about this, because you mentioned that 54 countries have lost access to capital markets because of the sort of general liquidity conditions, not because of they would have been in any particular problems, but because of the basically the liquidity conditions in the developed world. Now, I was wondering, we referred to Brady bonds, and could there be a sort of insurance policy against the liquidity shock in the following sense, that with Brady bonds you had the credit enhancements via IMF, like the Mexico deal in 1990. But because the risk sort of originates from the fact, presumably, that when liquidity conditions tighten, the rollover risk for the developing countries becomes much bigger, and hence the risk for those investors who have been investing in or lending to developing countries goes up. But if there would be this sort of scheme whereby either by directly linking to the bonds credit enhancements via IMF, as was done in the Brady bonds, it would ensure that the countries can roll over their debt, the developing countries, even in a sort of a regime where there's a liquidity squeeze, with the liquidity support in a way from the IMF, but clearly, as you said, the spreads are much higher and they go much higher compared to the developed countries in a crisis, and there would be a sort of liquidity backstop for the developing countries' debt. Sorry, it was a bit complicated.
Thanks. And there was at least a second one, please. I mean,
Your report includes a long list of policy recommendations, and some of them are about information sharing, some of them are about what governments should be doing. I think it will be very interesting to tell us what kind of response you have been getting from national governments, and what kind of dialogue and to what extent some of these have been picked up and implemented.
Anything else? There's one more.
Many thanks for the presentation. I think you've said a lot about borrowing and debt and all that. I haven't read the report, but do you explore issues about how the countries can actually use their own internal strengths, to be able to finance the SDGs? And here, I would want to know your thoughts about how they can leverage on, let's say, they are what do you call it, the natural resources. They are forests. They are iron ores, and they are fuels, and all that. I would want to hear your thoughts on that. And then there is also a big thing about illicit financial flows, right? I think that UNCTAD had some very grim estimates of that, and these are things that if the international community can come together and have a good look at it, these are things that would actually open a lot of spaces in terms of financing the SDGs. So these are things that I would want to hear your thoughts on. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Another set of 3 very good questions.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with the list of financial flows. So there is a big discussion on the list of financial flows, and there are actually 3 very different types of illicit financial flows. So one is tax related, and that's really linked to much of the discussions in International Tax Cooperation to reduce tax evasion, and then questions of whether tax avoidance gets included or not. The second is on corruption, and the third is on taxes, corruption, and okay, I'll remember in a second. But there are 3 very different types of illicit financial flows that have very different types of policy responses associated with them.
Could it be crime related then?
No. It's related to corruption. It's I just forgot the term. I will remember it. And so there is a lot of discussion going on trying to address. And in fact, the African group of African countries in the UN just submitted a resolution to have a UN tax convention, and there are two resolutions that are going on right now. One is on illicit financial flows that are being negotiated right now, and the second is on a UN tax convention. I don't know if that'll actually end up happening, but they're being debated right now on the tax piece and then on illicit financial flows more broadly. So it's a big issue, and though I do think it's important to think of the components separately, sometimes you add it up, and you may add up, you're adding up tax evasion with money counting illegal, like drug activity. And you can't really, when you think of these, you can't really add them up. But the headline numbers sound really big, and they can at least, they may be a good talking point to push action forward sometimes. But so that's a big discussion that's happening, and the report covers it every year in depth, the latest thinking on it, as well as ideas in each of these components as to how to address them. Okay, so that's on illicit financial flows. And then in terms of national actions, So in 2019, I think it was, the report highlighted something we were just talking about it this morning that called Integrated National Financing Frameworks. That was our thematic chapter. And the idea was, it's a very simple idea. It's that when you start looking around the world at countries having national sustainable development strategies, and in their national sustainable development strategies, they actually were beginning to incorporate the SDGs, but into planning. But most of the plans were not actually financed. And so there's a question of how do you bring financing into the planning process. And so we, working again with the entire task force, have laid out a process to begin thinking about across these different areas of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and across these different policies, the ones that are a lot of the policies we're talking about are, if you looked at the slide, and this is at the heart of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, is that there is both national actions and multilateral actions. So countries can't take care of the multilateral actions on their own. They can't solve international tax cooperation. They can't solve issues of systemic debt crisis on their own. So, but there are actions that they can do on their own, and we've created a framework for how countries can begin to think about incorporating these into their own planning processes. And right now, more than 80 countries have started to implement this, or to think about implementing it. It's still in the very early stages. But we do get discussions. So that's a lot. That's the sort of the mechanism we work with countries on. And UNDP is in the lead on the country work, and we are in the lead on thinking about what's the framework for doing this, to have a consistent framework across the board. Though it's not really a consistent framework because it's just ideas that are going to have to be implemented on a country level, and in every country it's going to be very different. And the idea is to have this very country-led processes. So, but we do constantly get a lot of capitals now read the report. So we know they read it. that I know, because they come and tell us that they're reading the report. So we know a lot of them are reading the report, and we know a lot of them are beginning to implement this framework to begin to implement some of this into their national planning processes. So, and then the final comment was more of a comment, I think, on liquidity. Yeah, I mean, the Brady bonds were an interesting thing because the countries actually bought the treasuries themselves. So, and it was in part worked because interest rates were so high that they could buy these bonds as a discount and then use the bonds as collateral for their debt to have some sort of a guarantee. There's a question of having some sort of international guarantee. It would certainly help. It can be tricky, I guess, to implement a program. There may be an interesting way to think about doing this linked to climate, possibly, or doing this linked to some of the global public goods that are global public priorities, so that rather than there may be something interesting that one could think about to link these together, so that there could be sweeteners that are done linked to some global priorities that could, so that the funding would then go into to climate or other actions that could help reach the goals.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. Amina, any further thoughts from your side?
No, I think Shari covered everything quite well.
Okay, so then let us thank the speakers once again. We got a very good start for this day, and then we move right to the next session. Thank you, everybody.
please choose wherever you'd like to sit. I'll join you in a minute. So I'll start out from here, but I will be sitting there with you. So good morning once again. I'm Tuuli Juurikkala from the Finnish Ministry of Finance, and I will be moderating our next panel on sovereign debt. And this is obviously no small topic, as we have seen already yesterday and this morning. It is safe to say it is also a topic and challenge of many countries in the world, whether rich or poor. But the nature of the challenge varies by country, and today we are here to discuss sovereign debt from a developing country perspective. Shari's presentation gave us a real kickstart to the day, so thank you for that. And next we wish to hear from our panelists what they see as the emerging sovereign debt challenges in developing countries and what may be the possible solutions. Just a few words from my side to start it out. So as we have already discussed from different angles, as a legacy of the pandemic, many developing countries are left with even higher levels of sovereign debt than before. Now many of these countries are already in or risk falling into debt distress and reversing their development gains. Going forward, the long-term development challenges have of course not gone anywhere either. Responding to all of these challenges and achieving economic growth will require sustainable investments and other reforms, while debt burdens need to be carefully managed. So generating growth while carefully managing debt is again a shared challenge of countries of all income levels, also our country. And on top of it all, we have to remain mindful of how the market does not always absorb debt quite like it has in recent years, which may reflect not only in prices but in volumes as well. We have not discussed it that much, and this is my last point. But obviously the developed country policy shifts have an impact on developing countries too, including through the financial markets. So let me now move on to introduce our speakers. With us here today, we have Andrea Presbitero of the IMF. Andrea is currently Senior Economist at the IMF and CEPR Research Fellow in the International Macroeconomics and Finance Program. He has also held assistant professor positions in different universities, as well as published broadly in top journals. We have also Arjan de Haan from the IDRC. Arjan leads the Supporting Inclusive Growth program at the International Development Research Centre, IDRC, in Canada. He has over 20 years of experience combining research and practice in international development and public policy. And last but not least, as we always say, Maureen Ware joins us from the Central Bank of Kenya and has worked extensively on debt in Africa. She has previously served also at WIDER and WTO, and her peer-reviewed research extends from macro policy topics to gender and development. Each panelist will now have up to 10 minutes for presentations, and at the end we will have a joint session of questions and answers. So if we start with Andrea, what do you think makes the current sovereign debt situation or even crisis different from the previous ones? So please go ahead.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks to Kunal, Tony, and everybody, and the Bank of Finland and WIDER for hosting. I think it's. I'm sorry I missed part of the conference yesterday. So I guess talking at dinner, I may sort of overlap on something that's already been said yesterday. But let me give you like a few sort of. I have a few charts, and then try to put maybe some of the things that already been mentioned, including this morning, in a sort of maybe slightly different order. But I don't know how much new things there will be. So the first thing I want to sort of point out, like this comes from ongoing work that we are doing at the fund on sort of on public debt. One way of, again, looking at the same thing from a slightly different angle, you can basically, the solid line is the share of countries which are currently in a sort of debt surge, meaning debt is increasing for quite some time. And as you can see, if you look at this historically, what's been happening right now, meaning in the 2000, it's very similar sort of in terms of trend of what happened in the 70s. And what you know is that after sort of the big upsurge in debt in the 70s, there's been this big wave of restructuring vis-a-vis official or private creditors. You see what is happening in the 2000. nothing has been happening. You know, this data ends in 2020. You can sort of push it a little bit farther to 2021. You can include the SSI and you have something, but you know, the SSI is very specific. Let me come back on that. There is not much in terms of restructuring and so on, and you can argue this has been driven because of like very sort of soft monetary policy, very good financing condition, and so on and so forth. But you know, if history repeats itself, and we don't know if history repeats itself, but then you can argue that, you know, that sort of restructuring is going to come at some point, and I guess everybody more or less is saying that between yesterday and today. What happened, and again, this is nothing new, but you know, if you want to compare the past from with what it is now, clearly everybody is talking about this changing creditor landscape, and here is basically the total stock of public external debt for DSSI eligible countries in the last 20 years, divided by creditor type, and it's, you know, generally people split Pari Club, multilateral, and all the rest. But even within all the rest, you see that all the rest is mostly China and bond holders. And then the big role of sort of this emerging donor is large, and especially in some countries. Like while China is more or less a relevant creditor for most of low-income countries, especially in Africa, bondholders is much more concentrated in a few, but still, like on average, there is a big change. And I guess the issue already came out instead of, you know, if you need to restructure, one thing is restructuring with like two creditors, meaning multilateral and bilateral, or, you know, ready plan early on. Different thing is restructuring with such a diverse pool of creditors. And, you know, I guess the delay of the common framework clearly testifies that. China is important, and so there are many things that one can say related to how China can affect lending to developing countries, which could be the implication. I don't have the time, and to be honest, I don't have even the expertise to go into that. Let me just point out two things. One is like very simple. If you want to look at the procyclicality of lending, we tend to argue, and there is an old literature on foreign aid, in which like Tony and others in the room contributed. We generally want aid to be counter-cyclical. That's what we want. And you know, if you, these are basically data from the World Bank. If you just regress aid on grow, and this could give you some sort of very rough measure of procyclicality. Pari and multilateral club tend to be counter-cyclical, especially the bilateral donors. If you look at China, it's basically, if anything, is pro-cyclical. I don't know how much trust I can put in those sort of coefficients, but if anything, it clearly doesn't signal that it's not the same at Pari club. So that's one problem. The other one is like, we can look at seniority. And what is interesting here is that this is basically a replication of a chart that Christoph Trebesch had in a paper on seniority of creditors. And what is nice here is that if you look at China, China is the red line. China tend to be like a sort of very junior creditor at the beginning of the period. If you look at the end of the period, it becomes like a senior creditor, very similar in some countries to sort of multilateral like the IMF and others. And so, looking forward, this is joint sort of not even work, just thinking with Tito Cordelli, in which one could sort of think which could be the implication of having, like, in some countries, two big creditors like China and the fund, which share very similar sort of seniority status. And this, you know, we can think that there are very sort of complicated implications because of that. Then the other issue about China, there is hidden debt. People have talked a lot about that, Carmen Reinhardt and a lot of collaborators at the World Bank. This is basically the chart as before, sort of updated to 2021 without the surges. But you know, if you're on top of the restructuring with Pari Club and private credit, you put China, and in this case also the DSSI, you can see that there are already a lot of restructuring coming over together with these big waves of big sort of surges in debt. So that's another way in which you can think that China is special, and this clearly connects to all the discussion about transparency and sort of having more information about outstanding debt position and restructurings. Then going home, why? Then if you have to restructure, I guess what is important to think is about which are the costs of restructuring. And there is a large literature, again, many people, including Ugo, contributed on that. Here I want to flag like a slightly different sort of a new flavor on the discussion on the restructuring, in which people don't look exactly at the economic costs, but mostly at the social costs, which I think it's very nice. It's this nice paper by Carmen Reinhardt and co-author at the World Bank, in which here basically do synthetic control. And so let's say that the dashed line is sort of an indication of how country would have gone without a sovereign default, and the solid line is how country actually gone after default. And here you can look at sort of, there is economic story, there is this big gap in GDP, and on the right-hand side, there is sort of the social, in this case, health story in which, this is measure of calorie intake, they do with poverty, do with energy consumption. So calorie intake is just because of better data, but still, like, there are large social costs from default. And I think something we should consider going forward. So what can people do about that? So how the international community reacted? First of all, there has been the DSSI, and second of all, the G20 Common Framework. On the DSSI, as been mentioned in the previous presentation, like, there is this discussion about, is a liquidity crisis, is a solvency crisis? I guess at the beginning with COVID, people rightly so thought it was a liquidity crisis, and the natural sort of reaction to a liquidity crisis is like, I just postpone payment. So was successful or not? We have a paper on that with a couple of quarters in which actually our answer is yes. So if you have a liquidity crisis, the policy response from the G20 was, yes, I postpone your debt service payment, I try to provide more liquidity, and in fact what we show here is that if you look at spreads, actually spreads went down. So countries with access to market, which is like a subset of those countries, were able to borrow at cheaper terms because of liquidity crisis. That was, I guess, a right response if you had like a very short shock. COVID was a long shock, so there was not like, now more is needed, and so we need more, and there is a large literature that tells you that, again, default are costly, and what is important is that you need to act quickly. And you don't have to drag. I guess the experience of HIPIC MDRI tell us that dragging and waiting and kicking the can down the road has been extremely costly. And we have to sort of act very fast. And the SSI was fast for liquidity, but was not fast enough to sort of now go into debt relief. And the G20 Common Framework is not, at the moment, is not really working. So I guess at the moment, like before this, I guess there is an agreement about 60%, 50% of countries in that distress. I guess it's irrelevant. It's a large number of countries which are close to that distress. And so action is needed. There is a lot of shock that are hitting those countries. It's been already discussed. I guess strong US dollar especially is going to be a big shock for those countries. So reprofiling and restructuring is needed. And the common framework clearly is sort of provide the framework to think about that, but much more is to be done, and so far has not been particularly successful. Thank you.
You're doing excellent on time. You let us with 2 extra minutes, actually. So thank you. That was most thought-provoking. I'm sure there will be lots of questions at the end. Next, I will turn to Arjan, who will share with us the main findings and policy lessons from the IDRC project on debt challenges in the MENA region. So please go ahead.
Thanks very much. You set a very high standard now. Please keep me to time, I feel. Thank you so much to the bank and to WIDER for this event. It's a great privilege to be here. Before I start, I just want to say that International Development Research Centre, it's part of the Canadian Development Programme. We're not a centre that does research. We're a centre that funds research in developing countries. So the right thing would have been, and Kunal has tried very hard to get Isaac Diwan, who is leading this project here, to talk about this. So I think economists think second best is okay. I don't think it's anything like that, and I'll prove that to you. The background to this, I'm talking about the research that we funded, we supported. The background to this was IDRC funded a quite big investment with southern think tanks in response to COVID, like many of the donors did. And in that period where we supported research looking at the COVID policies, and it's been very important in the discussion here already, including in the UNDESA report, is how the debt crisis, the debt issues came on top of the challenges that were already faced. Very important how low those how little fiscal space there was for those responses already, and I don't think we've seen a lot of that. Many of those supportive policies were withdrawn within 6 to 12 months or something, and that was at the same time as the debt crisis was happening. So that was the background to this research. So we're supporting about 6 country case studies in Africa, and then this regional commission that was led by the Economic Research Forum and by Isaac, who's both a fellow and at both those institutions. one of the interesting papers in there, which I definitely recommend, not in this one, but in the case studies in Africa, is work on Nigeria, where for example was looked at how the different scenarios on the which. I have to go back to the beginning, or I hope that was okay to go. Different scenarios under which debt relief could be productively invested. And I'll come back to that question later. So very quickly, I'll do the slides very quickly, just to make sure I do justice to the fact of the commission, rather than pretending it was my work. These were the terms of reference for a commission that looked at 6 countries, 6 countries in the MENA region. I'll show you the countries in a second. That looked at the development path in MENA, as particularly in the highly indebted one, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia. And they're very different, and Lebanon is an extreme of that. How to avoid financial crisis and recessions, and what reforms are needed. And the important thing, if Isaac had been here, I think he would have taken us away from a discussion about that, because he looks in particular, and Ebrahim as well. They look at Sudan and Lebanon as like it's the political crisis, it's the fragility here, and the debt crisis just on top of that. And again, I come back to that later. It's like the debt crisis. You can't think about it in isolation from the broader development challenges that those countries face. So these are the 6 countries that the Commission, and the report is out. I highly recommend reading the report. And the 2 most indebted countries which the report pays attention to are Lebanon and Sudan, and of course very different countries as well. And the important message there is and Isaac was telling me, is like, the MENA region. We don't talk a lot about the MENA region, but it's almost like an example for the rest of the world. Each region is different, but even if you take Lebanon, Sudan, and Egypt, they're completely different stories. All 3 countries need restructuring, but the implications of that in each country is very different. And it's an obvious point, but that's very important. And if I get a chance, I'd really love to talk about the IMF donor conditionalities, not in the sense whether conditionalities are good and bad, but how they can support the needed reform. So these are the key messages from the Commission. The first one absolutely leads to a financial crisis. I think if you look at Lebanon, it's already there. I don't think there's a question about a coming financial crisis in Lebanon. It's already there. Very importantly, austerity only adjustment leads to a social crisis. In fact, any social peace that exists has induced the financial crisis, if you like. It's financed by Lebanon, of course, is already in a crisis. Sudan has had a path out of fragility with fiscal investment. So the adjustment needs to take account of cutting that will have huge political implications. Yes, the IMF program and debt workout are of course very, very important, but and I'm not just saying the IMF and not because you're here, it's the broader restructuring, right? And the point you're making is like, well, there aren't actually that many of them in the past. It's actually quite important to that. The debt restructuring, whoever does it, is not sufficient. It needs a national renewal plan and credible enough to ignite growth. There are huge growth potential. Climate finance, action for climate is really important in that region, of course in a very different way. But it needs a modernization of the state. It needs and a state that adjusts to the new global issues, including the climate crisis. And finally, that economic reforms are deeply political, and we know that, but. And then again, I come back to the questions like, the question I also asked to the research team, right? It's like, okay, what are the implications of this? We all know this is the case. They are political. It needs, and I think Shakira was talking about it, need that kind of a national dialogue, civil society with that complex of creditors, right? But what does that then mean for the international community to how they lead that restructuring? And it needs, in the MENA region, it sounds typical, but it isn't. It needs to generate that trust and confidence. How have I done for time so far?
with time, so you have 4 minutes left.
The last points then that I want to make, four things, and they're very, like I said, this is the work of that commission. I want to make sure I did justice to that. The four issues that come out for me that I hope that are relevant for this debate. One, as everybody said, the threat of the crisis is real. I think it's already there. We should probably stop talking about an imminent crisis. It's already there. Lebanon being the clearest example. Egypt is a clear example as well. Austerity packages, it's about cutting expenditure. Austerity packages just won't do because of this social unrest that will follow. The market impacts, of course, as well as social unrest. I wonder why I'm saying this. I think we've just seen this in the UK, haven't we? I mean, the government collapsed exactly on those issues. You can't see this in isolation. So the important thing really to put in the debate is that whichever that restructuring, whichever the international support is given, needs to mobilize that internal reform. And that's where I come back to the questions about conditionalities. Conditionalities is a terrible word in many circles. Many civil society hates the conditionalities, but you need the right conditionalities in a way. And even the work at the IMF has very clearly demonstrated how hard it is for the international community to impose those conditionalities. Again, to organize that restructuring in a way that organizes that reform. And within that, and again I come back to, I think Shakira put that very well, is that needs to be through a broad-based consultation internationally, including with the civil society, because this international civil society continues rightly to put pressure on those issues, but also the internal dialogue. Of course, it is primarily with the banks, with the government, and in Kenya we know this as well. Civil society there also plays an important role. Needs to be somehow involved in that debate. The private sector needs to be part of that. So and then it sounds like the HIPIC debates in the 2000s, but then it's so different because of the different nature of the different structure of that. So it's I think there's a real challenge, and these processes are political, and we really need to bring those into the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arjan. You were also doing very well on time, so thank you. And this is really, I'm thinking we are in the same but different world, in that the structure of debt might be different, but we go back to the basics where we need to have the national ownership of the reform programs to start with, to do any significant reforms. But next, I turn to Maureen. And Maureen will talk about the public debt crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. How large is it? What are its drivers? And why does it matter? So please, Maureen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I'll opt to stand for a change. Yeah, so I was asked to talk about the public debt in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. How large is it, and what are the drivers? I think you made my life very easy, because some of the issues that we've been talking since about yesterday are quite summarized as well, what I'm going to talk about. However, I'll try to put this in context. And one issue I would like to say is that we've been hearing about the 60% since morning, I think since from the first keynote address. What I'll try to do in this presentation is to try and unpack it and conceptualize it in the context of sub-Saharan African countries. Okay, don't know why the slides are not working. Okay, there we go. So we were limited to 4 slides, so I'll try to summarize. So basically, if you look at this chart, what we see is that debt to GDP ratios have edged up from about 50% in just before the pandemic in 2019 to 57.6% in 2020 and 57 in 2021. As you can see, there was kind of the ratios edged up much faster following the COVID pandemic. And in fact, if you look at these ratios, excluding Nigeria and South Africa, they are much higher at about 61%. Now, one would argue that these are quite minimal numbers compared to what we are seeing in advanced countries. But in the context of these countries, these numbers mean a lot, and I'll come back in a little time. Also, averages can be misleading, so what I try to do is, let's see, this is based on the regional economic outlook for sub-Saharan Africa, which is very current. It came out this month. So we see that some of the countries which are actually already in debt distress are already having government-to-debt GDP ratios of over 100. And if you look at these countries, already there are some of them, like as I'll show you in the next chart, like Zambia, Mozambique are already actually in debt distress, meaning that they're actually not even able to meet their debt obligations. In this chart, of course, I have excluded South Africa, but I think I heard Amina comment that you are also struggling. The debt to GDP ratio is about, I think, 67 point something %. And we always want to exclude our big brother because sometimes when you talk about sub-Saharan Africa, these countries can be quite heterogeneous. So here I've just presented the debt to GDP ratios, and in the next chart, what you see is that the point we've been talking about is this increased debt vulnerabilities. And as you can see from this chart, more and more countries are facing risk of debt distress. And I single out here, what I put in this chart is specifically sub-Saharan African countries. But of course, we have already other countries which are already in debt distress, like Sudan. Sudan is here, Somalia is here, but since those ones don't fall in sub-Saharan African countries, I excluded them. So one point is, if you look at the DSS, these are the countries that the IMF, they are covered by the IMF, World Bank, DSA analysis, that is debt sustainability framework analysis of the IMF and World Bank. They cover 35 countries. And out of these 35 countries, these are 35 out of 45 sub-Saharan African countries. The DSAs are publicly available for 34 countries, except, I think, Eritrea. And I just took the DSA just before the pandemic, and that was 2019. And the DSA, as of last month, in September. And what you see is like there's this quick transition. If, for example, if you take countries like, Kenya, Malawi, just before the pandemic, this debt distress was being rated as just being moderate. But they quickly transitioned and graduated to high risk. Now, if you look at the countries that are in low risk, just before the pandemic in 2019, we had Madagascar, Rwanda, Senegal, Tanzania, Uganda. In fact, Tanzania has always been regarded as this low risk debt distress, low risk of debt distress for quite a long while. But all of a sudden, they have graduated to moderate. And I think what would be deceiving here is to have maybe some comfort that if you are in moderate, you are comfortable. Because as we see, the transition from graduating from moderate to risk, to high risk category can be very fast, depending on the circumstances, and especially given the vulnerabilities. So which countries do we now have in low risk? Basically, we are not left with any. I think Eritrea, we don't know where to place it because its DSA is not publicly available. But if you look at the sub-Saharan African countries, we are basically saying that virtually all the 35 countries that are covered by the DSA are facing some form of risk, of debt distress risk, be it moderate, be it high, or actually in actual debt distress. And if you look if you take these countries out of the total 45 countries, then these countries make 3/4. So basically about 76%. And if you take countries that are in debt distress and they are at high risk of debt distress, they constitute 40% of the 45 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So that tells you just how vulnerable the entire continent or this region is facing. And if you, of course, combining this with the other countries in the northern MENA region. So what I think the presentation that we just had by my colleagues talked about, and also what we've been hearing since morning is the composition of the debt and how this has changed. And what this has, the point that I wanted to make is, I think, what was made by the panelists before our panel, that the cost of servicing debt has really gone up. And just to show, I just took this as an example from Kenya's case. So if you look at the increased cost of debt servicing associated with the increase in the private and commercial debt, so you see that almost like 68% of the interest payments are going to bilateral or commercial debt. And only only small proportions, of course, go to the multilateral. So what that shows is this, whereas the composition of commercial debt has gone up almost to about a third, then it comes with the high costs of servicing. And so how did we get here? Or how did these countries get where they are right now? There have been quite some factors that have been developing over time. And as I said, how many minutes do I have? Okay. So I'll try to summarize this. And the key drivers of this public debt that we are seeing has been increased investment, demand for infrastructure development. If you look at most of these countries, either they are, like my own country, we have had the standard gauge railway. Most of these countries have had this massive investment in infrastructure. We have the roads, the energy, and this is where the China factor comes in. Most of these have been through large-scale financing from Chinese loans. And part of that's what has taken us where we are. And then there was also this increased ability to borrow following the improved macroeconomic management and strong economic performance, particularly since the 2000s. And also the HIPC debt relief. What this did, especially for the HIPC countries, was to provide an ample space for borrowing, because it substantially lowered their public debt burden. But what that done is that when they went to this borrowing spree, they have ended up again like in a crisis where they almost found themselves before. And then we had come the financial crisis, and we had these favorable global financing conditions when the advanced countries, starting of course with the US, lowered their interest rates almost to zero. And then there were also favorable rating following the favorable economic growth that was going on. If you recall, that time we had the Africa rising narrative. So most of these countries took advantage of the favorable interest rates to go and to the international market and issue for sovereign bonds. And then before we know what's happening, I think it's been said that just before the pandemic, already these countries' debts were already going up. But we all know that the we had this adverse impact of the COVID pandemic, which had two double effects on revenues because of the lockdown measures and all this, and also the growth that most countries recorded negative growth rates, and this had really a severe impact on them. And then what you are seeing is a U-turn. Remember, I talked about the favorable financial conditions, but now what you are seeing with the increases, interest rate hikes in the advanced economies, the interest rates in the international markets have gone up. My own country, last month, wanted to issue a sovereign bond, but we could not because of these high rates. So we are seeing a situation where countries are actually now being kept out again, and also facing high rollover effect, costs, because most of these bonds are actually approaching maturity. There are some that are going to mature in the near future, and we expect even this cost of servicing to go high. So we see a situation where countries are even borrowing to, again, finance or to pay debts. So it becomes like a vicious circle. I think Amri's presentation, you talked about this high dependency on commodities. We've been hearing about this, and this makes these countries very vulnerable, also to the exchange rate shocks. As we speak, we know that the dollar has been strengthening. So the debt, most of these countries has seen their currencies depreciate. Over 50% of their foreign debts are in US dominated. So what this means that their cost of their debt goes up even without doing anything much. And then of course there's these issues of maturity mismatches, because most of these countries that have borrowed even to finance this infrastructure development, we know this comes with a lag when it comes to revenue generation, and we've not seen that. So you're borrowing short term, and your revenue streams are in domestic currency, and they have long gestations before you get the fruits of it, and then you have these loans that you have to kind of pay back or service quite quickly. So because of that, you have to again borrow, because your revenues are not matching what you borrowed. Then you have these fragile countries, which characterized with civil strife and fragility of some of these economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I hope I've not taken
yes. Now, your insights bring us directly to the questions and answers session. And actually, I would like to start out while others might still contemplate their questions. I might wish to start with one myself, and you can choose if you want to respond. So my question is, what do you think needs to be done to improve future debt restructuring processes? And how do you see the role of the private sector in this? So if anyone would like to comment. Silence.
No, I can
Yes, thank
start.
You.
I guess it's probably the harshest question, but also the one that I guess everybody was expecting. I don't know. Like, I think it's very complicated, and to some extent the fact that the common framework started like a year and a half ago, and we have 3 countries which sort of apply to that, and they're going through that like very slowly for, I guess, in part like domestic condition, and in part like really issue related to creditor coordination. So I guess in the session before something has been mentioned. There's a lot of discussion how one can bring creditors to the table, and I guess it's on that the role for sort of, as we mentioned before, like civil society, and a lot of pressure from bilaterals and multilaterals is incredibly important, I think. And so my take on that, and again, I should have said at the very beginning, is my own personal view. It doesn't reflect the view of the institution, especially now, is that I thought, like when COVID came, we knew that there was a lot of problems, and I guess she made a very good point in saying that many countries, especially in Africa, issued sovereign bonds, and this was very risky and ex ante. And we know that there are this incredible bullet repayment coming due 2023, 2024. This is all known before COVID, so we knew that that this stress was very high. I was working in Senegal and Senegal was performing very well, it's growing very fast, but still like debt service is an issue exactly because of sovereign bonds. And it's not like, you know, I'm Italian, you know, so we know about debt problems. But, you know, if you are Italy, like you issue a lot and then, you know, you roll over, it's not an issue, no, you don't care, you know, keep on rollovering as long as the debt management office works, it's one thing. If you have like 2 bonds outstanding, rolling over of that is a big issue because, you know, if liquidity goes down, it's just what happened. Liquidity now, it's not there. Kenya is not able to issue in the market, Senegal yes, but who knows in a year time. So that was a risk ex ante that we knew. COVID came and to me, like, for the HIPIC, we went to that relief with a lot of time and with a lot of push, like from everyone, from the Pope to Bono, and to some extent, I don't know if it's good or bad, but we ended up in providing that relief, okay? Now it seems to me that the political case is easier. Because with HIPIC, you know, you can have a lot of counter arguments, say, you know, those countries did mistakes and they overborrowed, and I don't want to take stance, but, you know, you can have good arguments on both cases. Now it's really pure exogenous shocks. So I guess politically, there should be much more sort of unity in sort of providing sort of, you know, debt relief or reprofiling or restructuring. So I guess that there is a lot of scope to do that, and kind of disappointing that it's taking so long. And my point is the presentation is that it's very costly to wait, and sort of the cost of waiting, it's actually increasing over time, and it's now 2 years. Yeah.
Thank
Maybe
you.
it was a long question.
Thank you very much.
Answer.
Arjan? Maureen?
Yeah, so I'll start from where I just ended. I think what's been challenging in this case compared to what we saw with the HIPIC issue is that this multiplicity of the creditors. So the question is, for example, the commercial debt, how do you then approach them, and how do you be able to bring them on table so that you're not only talking about the Paris Club members or as it was before. And I think for me, what is needed is the international coordination of this. I think that if we had more of that coordination, it's easier to, approach it holistically and put. So we have both domestic, where we are involving the civil societies and the private sector, but internationally we must see that coordination coming in quite strongly for this to happen, because if we don't have that, then we are seeing a situation where like every country is just left to fight for itself. And I mean, God for us all kind of approach. Yep. And the other thing is, yesterday there was a question that was asked, like, why are some of these countries shying away, for example, for approaching the G20 common framework for restructuring? I mean, it's also this stigma that comes with it. Because you go for the debt restructuring, you're given bad ratings, and then it all kind of makes your situation even look more gloomy, and then, you know, everybody then shuns away from you. And so I don't know, like, that issue of how we need to give these countries, and that's why we need this coordinated international response, so that you are not like almost feeling isolated or humiliated that you are going for this, you know, because sometimes it looks like, okay, if countries go for debt restructuring, then their credit ratings, it means like they're doing so awful that now nobody wants to hear about them. And in fact, what has happened even for those countries that have gone there, what happens is that their interest rate spreads, it goes just hayway, because it means like, so what you are doing, you are actually doing more damage to these countries. So we need to manage that in a way that can give confidence.
Thank you, Maureen. And Arjan, you want to add something?
Yes, and when I agree that the two previous speakers, my concept is the yes, but there's such a big, and I was trained as a historian, and I almost feel like we should absolutely stop talking about HIPIC. The world is so different now that the lessons from that, apart from it's costly to delay, that's absolutely a critical question. It is just, the situation is too different. We need, as I was saying, we need that international coordinated response, but it's not the same as it used to be. The fact that those debt restructurings are not happening is, perhaps because there isn't an international commitment, but I don't think that's where the problem lies. It is because countries are pushing back. It's like the way that the debt restructuring is presented does not fulfill their need. Ethiopia, I heard that one of the research work in Ethiopia is like, I read the IMF statement on Ethiopia back in June. It's like, oh, restructuring will come. And the IMF team was in town again. It's like, it's not coming. Why? We don't 100% know. And that's why we need to figure this out. Within that, I do want to bring in a very important differentiation, because there's a lot of, and in Maureen's slide as well, right, that the private sector isn't that important in all countries. In many of the countries, you have the previous situation, if you like. If you take Sudan, for example, I think Sudan, that's all multilateral debt still, and many of the countries you list there as well. So there you have a situation where the international coordination does work, but in the others, it doesn't. Countries are putting back. And bringing the private sector into the picture is absolutely critical, both at the international level, but also then that also needs to, and that's where the hippie kind of discussion just are not suited for this situation. And to build that national ownership, civil society is important, but there at that level too, this private sector needs to be brought in much more strongly than we've ever seen.
Thank you. So let's move on to questions from the audience. I think I saw Ika here first. And then, yes.
Thank you. I have a very fascinating interventions, all three. I have a comment and a question, and the comment is first to Andrea on, I'm not surprised that the Chinese lending appears to be pro-cyclical. It's mostly, I mean,
aid.
Chinese development banks lend into big infrastructure projects, which often go to Chinese contractors, and they sort of, almost by definition, they create growth. And then actually continue on this, I have a question to Maureen on, now that the Chinese banks and some other companies are big lenders in sub-Saharan Africa as well, and you mentioned that some countries are now in even greater difficulties in servicing their debt. Do you have any sense of what is the approach of China and Chinese actors in this, if countries need to reschedule their payments and so on? That would be interesting to hear. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So, I suggest we take the questions one by one so that we don't forget what we had as the first. So please go ahead. Who wants to start?
Okay, so yeah, so we had the DSSI, the debt suspension initiative, which we did have a chance to restructure the Chinese loans as well. I mean, debt servicing as well. But that is how far it went. And I think there has been all these views about whether DSSI was effective, it was not effective. But I think, as Andrea mentioned, it was supposed to be short-term, and it served its purpose to be short-term. But what has happened is that it's like denying maybe someone postponing the payments, but when they accumulate, you still have to pay them. And I think that's where now challenge comes, and this is where most of these countries are. So there was that limited breathing space, but we are seeing now a situation where they have to pay either way. And that's where now the restructuring comes in. It's been a bit, this is where we say that, as he says, it's quite different, because then it would be much easier if we were talking about, like, it's like more of every country on its own, because then every country, if you have to have a negotiation with the creditor, in this case, the big creditor being China. And I think every case is like being handled in its own merit. So we are hoping that we can see more of this happening. But it's still challenging at the moment.
Andrea, you wanted to add something?
No, I think she answered already. Like, I guess the issue on I know there are case studies in different countries. I guess it makes a big difference, like in the relative way that China or other emerging donors have in the country. So exactly, there's a point I was making about seniorities. Like if it's such a big lender and it's sort of behave like senior, then you have too senior in one country, and then the IMF cannot lend in arrears. So it's complicated. If it's a tiny, it's a bit of a problem. But I guess that now it's more the discussion is mostly on interest and not on net NPV reduction, which I guess that's what hold the common framework.
Okay. Thank you. And the first question came from Ika Korhonen at Bank of Finland. Please, next speakers, introduce yourself, because we might have someone online who was not with us yesterday. I think next I had Ugo.
Hi, I'm Ugo Panizza from the Geneva Graduate Institute. So I don't know, a comment/question and an anecdote. So let me start with the anecdote. So now this too little, too late is, the fund says it. So it was actually an official policy document of the fund. So not even it's Andrea is like in the fund position. The anecdote is that for saying this in 2006, I almost got fired. So so I was called in the office of the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, and they told me, you cannot write this stuff, it's irresponsible, and blah, blah, blah. So things have changed a lot, which is good. But we still don't understand why these defaults come too little and too late. And that's my comment/question. That is like a big area for research, which has massive policy importance, because like Andrea said, like everybody said, this amplify the cost of this event.
Thank you, Hugo. Would anyone like to reflect directly on this? Why do we have too little, too late? Why we still have too little, too late?
Yeah, maybe
Please.
like one way of thinking is that apart from the anecdote that I hope is like orthogonal to me, but no, I think but I guess the first thing I think I would notice, like sort of to move away from a very negative view to a more positive view, that things really changed a lot in 15 years. I guess like the attitude, especially from multilaterals to debt relief, is way different than it used to be. But on the too little, too late, I think thinking more as a sort of as a research than a sort of from a policy perspective, I think there is a lot of role for research here to push. Like if you go back again to the sort of the Krugman papers and the old papers, we know that in economic terms it makes sense under certain conditions for creditors and debtors to provide debt relief. There is a very solid economic argument which apparently is not pushed that much. And so I guess that should be the argument that people should push. And I don't see that, and people should go back and read like the old sort of the Krugman and the Sachs and the other paper at the time, Tuuli. There's a lot of literature on that in the 80s, and I guess that, and maybe more is needed now. And the other one, if I can react to what she said about the stigma thing, like for instance, in our DSSI paper, we were really motivated by that and by the fact that credit rating agency were saying, oh yeah, if you apply for the DSSI, you're gonna be destroyed. In reality, no. We basically say that there was not stigma attached to that, and if it's a sort of an anecdote. In the slides, we have that we start with a quotation from a Minister of Finance in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not sure it's Kenya, it could be, and then saying that we're not going to apply because there is stigma attached to that. It's going to be costly, and then after our paper, but it's uncorrelated to that, but still it's there. Then they say, yes, we're going to apply, and in fact, there is no stigma. And there is no stigma. And so one can provide the research and try to sort of show that it's going to be the case. And even for the common framework, if it starts in a certain way and there is gray and there is sort of agreement, then stigma goes down. Stigma is endogenous. There is stigma because it's not working. The moment it works, stigma goes out.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to underline that. I mean, it's the end of this session. Too little, too late, I think is I'm not going to leave this meeting with that conclusion because it's not the right thing to be negative. There are problems that the international community has to contribute to, and I don't think it's actually accurate. Everybody has been commenting on this was coming. I mean, IDRC in Nairobi has been there's publication 3 years ago has been, and then COVID came, and so I don't think there's a terrible slow response. I think the important thing, and the stigma is really important in this, is to really think how how the international community and support has changed. You heard me probably muttering when China was mentioned. So like we just have to get used that that's how the world has changed, that it isn't the same as it was, and that what the international community, what IMF does, they now have to, as they do, as the national governments will take account of like the actions they have with the IMF, will have impact on our credit rating, will have an impact on all sorts of other things. We have to work with that entire community. So I think realizing that the old donor community is less and less important, that is happening very gradually, and I think much too slowly. We should be much more upfront and clear about that and reflect that in our international debates. But that's, let's not then come to the conclusions like, oh, we didn't respond to this crisis in time.
Thanks a lot. I still have at least Shakira, Tony, and Sanjay. So please, Shakira.
Just a comment and a question.
I'm sorry, please introduce yourself to the...
Shakira Mustafa, I'm a researcher at ODI. One of the things we've looked at quite in depth is Chinese debt restructuring process. And I think people really underestimate how fragmented a lender China is. So it's just one person making the decision, but this is how we're going to treat all debts. So zero interest loans have a higher probability of being cancelled. And the more commercial the loan is, the less scope there is for debt relief. And I think the previous panel yesterday, someone mentioned this issue of personal liability. If it's your loan in that Chinese agency that's problematic and it's cancelled, that has reputational effects for you, and it basically could end your career. And that personal liability element is some people from the outside don't really take into account. So that's that comment. And please, check ODI if you want to learn more about the Chinese restructuring process. The second question I had, given the reputational effects of things like the DSSI, the Common Framework, we know there's a lot of focus in using contractual clauses to facilitate debt restructuring and temporary relief, specifically things like a natural disaster clause. If a country has a certain shock that's defined in the contract, debt service payments will be suspended for 1 or 2 years. That's an idea that's been around for a very long time and hasn't really taken off for a variety of reasons. The most recent IMF publication seems to say it only is feasible for small island development states facing large exogenous shocks. Mm-hmm. So my question for Andrea is really what's your opinion on these state contingent clauses? And if you're a fan of it, what do you think the role of the IMF would be? Thank you.
Thank you. So straight to Andrea.
Yeah, very quickly on the first phase, on the first comment on China. Yeah, it's true. It's very complicated, and it's also true that there is an issue of transparency that it's both on the lender and on the borrower as well. So if you are then a multilateral, really in some countries we don't have a clue of where they're borrowing from, and for some specific bond it's difficult to have information, and the fact that you look at a lot of researchers coming up with data on exposure or stock of external debt versus China, and you get very different numbers. And people scraping website and whatever. And to me, it's so something. I guess Anna Gelber made the point that this is basically obligation you have versus your citizen, and so there should be the maximum transparency. And I guess that's a big issue which is not really addressed. On the state contingent, I guess not surprisingly, a view similar to what Ugo said yesterday. That to me, it's a big puzzle in the sense that some of these instruments seems to be very low-hanging fruit. And they're not there. I understand the counter argument that there could be a lot of manipulation, especially in some countries. It goes again into the data transparency, quality of data, and so you can play around with a lot of stuff. But for instance, I was discussing, and that goes again similar to a point that she raised about, for instance, the strength of the dollar and the currency mismatch, and a lot of that comes with sort of devaluation of local currency, and so that build up. One issue could be that you can hedge currency risk issuing ex-ante instrument, and there could be effort from the I know that there is a lot of ongoing discussion in the multilateral community to develop instrument that sort of through which country can issue and then immediately hedge, and that would be a similar way of doing something which was try to solve the problem ex ante rather than ex post. And for instance, why it's very easy sort of to tweak GDP data to sort of get around sort of state contingent debt related to GDP, but because it's not observable, exchange rate are observable. daily. And so if you think that's something going on, you can, reprice. And so I guess that's maybe an area in which the market can work better.
Thank you. We are soon running over time, but I suggest we still take Tony and Sanjay, if nobody objects. So there you go.
Yeah. Tony Addison from Copenhagen University and UNU-WIDER. So we know that when you're designing an adjustment or a stabilization program, if you have generous external assistance, including debt relief, then that really helps you mitigate the social and economic costs, as Andrea pointed out, simply because you will have more fiscal space and more opportunities to put in social protection and other good things. But what if we don't really have that generous external assistance? In other words, if we don't have that effective international response which people are calling for? So here I'm being rather cynical about the reactions of the international community, because quite a lot of the aid effort now is basically pro-cyclical. It's not just China. You look at, say, the United Kingdom, where aid has basically become pro-cyclical, in my view. So what the question for the panel is then, in the absence of the effective international responses that we've all been talking about in this meeting, what do you advise the Minister of Finance or the central bank governor or the policymakers in general to do?
That's not an easy one, but why don't we start now from Arjan? Would you like to comment?
Right. Before lunch or after?
We can continue over the lunch, of course.
I just because we're running into lunch, that's too much. But absolutely think about how the world has changed. I mean, if there's one thing I would be critical of, would be the president of the World Bank that back in May suddenly was so surprised when he discovered how much China's lending there was and how little this was known. David Dollar in 2007 in Beijing would have told you that. I haven't seen the ODI work, but that's exactly the kind of stuff that we need to incorporate. It's like, yes, it is different. You don't have the impact that Bono had in 2000, so you won't have that international response. But much more importantly, that entire story is so far less important. We've got to live with that new reality. It's like that graph is just mind-boggling how little debt restructuring there has been. The official ones, right? The old multilateral world, if you like, whether it's Paris Club, IMF, doesn't matter. It's far less important. So that's the new reality. I mean, again, it's very different in different countries, right? There's a couple of countries, fragile countries, where there hasn't been that pro-cyclical investment. It's a bit more of the old world. I think that's still very workable there. But in the new one, don't rely on the stuff we did 20 years ago.
Thank you. Maureen, would you like to go next?
So now that I work in central bank, maybe I'm the one to be advised. But okay, but on a more serious note, So what countries are doing is to do, of course, now I talk in the case of my own country, to do the physical consolidation. And of course, this comes with a cost. So the social cost cannot be avoided. So somehow you must feel it, because we are having a situation where your physical space is limited, and so you have to kind of try to do the best you can within your limited space. And that cost, actually, already we are working towards that, and that comes, as I said, comes with some painful, because how do you then, in these economies, unlike advanced economies where we have, for example, the social protection schemes, unfortunately in our case, we have this large informal sector, and most people just survive, live hand to mouth. So you also, even when the government wants to, for example, provide these social protection or safety nets, it's limited. I'll give you an example with this current inflation. And we, for example, we've been having fuel prices going up. And we have had a situation where to at least provide some cushion the vulnerable groups, the government has been trying to provide some fuel subsidy. But as we speak, it's come to a situation where I think the government has realized this is not sustainable, especially in the current circumstances. So somehow, of course, you have to devise a way in such a way that you now prioritize your expenditures, try to prioritize expenditures where more would benefit, where you think that at least you can be able to safeguard, not so much to a larger scale, but at least where you can be able to make sure that the social spending is not so much adversely affected. Consolidation also means that perhaps some of these development expenditures, the big whatevers, may have to slow down, and this is some of the costs that these countries have to live with. Having said that, I would say that African countries are very resilient. And Africans are very resilient, they are very hardworking people. If you look at how these economies have emerged from the pandemic, without much of the kind of social protection and support that we saw in advanced economies. 2021, on average, sub-Saharan African countries grew by 4.7%, I think, based on IMF report that had just been released. My own country, they just had a growth rate of 7.5%. And if you look at how, where they are coming from, I mean, the situation was quite there, not so much support. So on a positive note, these economies are quite resilient. And thanks to the hardworking spirit, or where you have to wake up and find where you're going to put bread on the table the following day, I think that we still emerge out of it stronger.
Thank you, Maureen. That's such a positive note. I'd still like to give it to Andrea and Sanjay. So, please,
in
Andrea.
the time, I think she said way better than I should have said. But I think Tony's question, it's very good in the sense it brings us back sort of to the basics, and to some extent contradicting myself before. Like it's true that the environment is such that I really don't see a positive shock. I just see a lot of negative shocks, and including foreign aid for political reasons. Why advanced economies should increase budget for foreign aid. There's never be political support domestically, So, and therefore, that exactly leads to fiscal consolidation. And I guess in that report, I guess there's some sort of calculation of how much countries should consolidate to bring that back to 70%, or for the other sort of to stabilize that. And I guess that's I think where we should go, and ongoing work that we've been doing is exactly which are the best way to consolidate, and sort of a little bit on the fiscal side, and mostly through grow. The experience tell us the only way to reduce that is through grow, and Africa being more resilient, and still it's true that the African narrative is the old now, but still countries are growing, and some of them, especially East Africa, but also West Africa. So I guess that's where sort of that stabilization can come.
Okay, thanks a lot. And the final word from Sanjay, please.
My questions would be very short, and it's directed to Andrea. Two small questions. First is that you kind of mentioned Krugman's some of the excellent papers in the 80s, but I remember again from the memory, I could be wrong, that is one of the main assertions of Krugman was that there are lots of private debt restructuring, like debt buybacks or debt equity swaps. Okay, now you can all replicate it by a simple debt forgiveness. Okay, so that if the IMF or one central body just kind of engages a very simple principle, then it could be all replicated. So my first question is that it has been almost 30, 40 years since Krugman's paper. So, and there have been a lots of private, debt restructuring mechanisms have been kind of floated. So do you think, in the hindsight, Krugman was right, that is, there's not much of a, there's lots of, bills and jingles about that private debt restructuring, but actually a simple mechanism would have been better. That's the number one. And number two question is that, like, I know that is a complicated, you mentioned it a number of times, that is China's role as a kind of a senior kind of a creditor. Now, so if I understand that, it is almost kind of equivalent to a bank debt, right? Because in a multiple creditors, bank debt would be always the senior. So when it comes to the restructuring, so the senior debtor actually kind of, once he or she kind of gets the money, he leaves the scene. So it doesn't have much of an incentive to restructure debt. So is it that kind of a complications that you're kind of referring to, that is China is taking all their dues and leaving the scene and having the debt restructuring process in incomplete and messy situation? These two questions.
Thank you, and over to Andrea.
Yeah, quickly, maybe we can talk more over lunch, but I guess
Yes.
the issue on China and seniority could simply be that, in the end, if you want China to participate, so meaning that being less senior and take the hit, then, for instance, one way of thinking about that could be also thinking about the governance or international institutions more generally. So if you want China to participate, and then you want also, then that should be reflected in how much weight they have in the institution. So there is an issue of equity here that could be to make. I think that complicates the issue. And on debt relief and how complicated it is and if it can be replicated, I don't know. One first reaction is that, after HIPIC, where it was we provide common reduction to everybody, and institution be criticized because, we have to tailor things to country needs. And now it's tailored to country needs, country by country, but then we know that if you go country by country, it's very complicated because, Kenya has to negotiate with some people and some others to negotiate with some other people. So I don't know, going into something more common and homogeneous, I guess we are not in that situation if we can afford to do that. So that's by construction more complex.
Well, thank you, Andrea. I'd like to end on a positive note of national ownership, positive view on growth, resilience, and so forth. And we'll continue from here during the lunch. Thank you. Thanks.
I was very glad that you said that. Right? We're going to now have the third keynote and the closing session of this conference. It's a very exciting conference. We heard lots of great presentations and discussion. I'm really pleased to welcome the keynote speaker for this session. I'm Kunal Sen, the director of UNU-WIDER. The third keynote, the title is Climate Finance within the UN Climate Convention, Can and Will It Be Fixed? We need to have the answer at the end of this session. So let me introduce the speaker, Sarah Colenbrander, who is the director of the Overseas Development Institute, ODI's Climate and Sustainability Program. She's an environmental economist who has supported policymakers across Asia, Africa, and Latin America to develop low-carbon development strategies. Before joining ODI, Sarah was the head of global programs for the Coalition for Urban Transitions, a network of 35 organizations, including ODI, that supports national governments to identify and implement the deep structural shifts needed to foster productive, inclusive, and sustainable cities. She was the lead author of Climate Emergency, Urban Opportunity, the report that underpinned the Infrastructure, Cities, and Local Action track of the 2019 UN Climate Summit. Sarah's authored a wide range of academic papers, as well as reports for the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN Environment, and the World Bank. She's also an associate of the ESRC Center for Climate Change Economics and Policy, and a guest lecturer at the University of Oxford, University College London, and the University of Manchester. So we have about 10 days to COP27, I think. And clearly, this particular question that Sarah's going to try and address is absolutely central to the discussion that will happen in the COP27 very shortly. So Sarah, we're expecting a clear answer, but it's great to have you here, and look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Kunal. It's a real pleasure to be here and a great privilege to be at this first conference by the Bank of Finland and UNU-WIDER. I have learned so much from the discussion over the last couple of days. You might have heard in the unnecessarily long bio that Kunal just shared, not much mention of finance, so it's been a very steep learning curve, and thank you for that crash course on debt and innovative finance. When I sent over the original title to this presentation, I did think it was provocative, but as COP27 has approached, I think we need to be a bit more provocative again, and I'm rebranding this conversation why COP27 is going to fail. So hopefully that's an answer to, will the climate finance system be fixed? So let me start off by explaining that I recognise that today I'm going to be talking about what is in your terms an incredibly small amount of money, $100 billion. I know that is obviously a huge amount for some of the climate vulnerable nations or for individual countries in terms of their debt, but in the global scheme of the amount of finance that we need to raise and steer to have a low carbon and climate resilient world, it's obviously a drop in the ocean. Where we currently stand is that in the Paris Agreement on climate change from 2015, there is a little clause tucked away, Article 2.1c, which was negotiated maybe 3 hours before the end of the Paris Agreement. So unlike most of the Paris Agreement, it doesn't have a huge amount of thought behind it. And we don't really know what it looks like to operationalise it. And that clause of the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1c, pledges that all finance flows must increasingly be consistent with low carbon and climate resilient development pathways. So that big circle there, and this is not to scale, that big circle there represents the aspiration. In practice, worldwide, domestically and internationally, the most authoritative source on the topic estimates there was about $632 billion a year currently spent very clearly on reducing emissions or on adapting to climate change. The 100 billion goal that was promised is a small part of that, but a significant part of that for reasons I'll go into in a moment. And of course, I think most of you will know that we missed the 100 billion a year target in 2020. We missed the 100 billion a year target in 2021, and I assure you we are going to miss it again in 2022. So I am speaking very narrowly about that small amount. And why does that small amount matter so much? There's three main reasons that the 100 billion a year matters. The first one is it is a very important symbol of which countries are historically responsible for climate change and therefore the responsibility that they have to support other countries with the transition. It is about relations. It is part of a broad effort to demonstrate international solidarity and cooperation on climate change, and often conversations about finance are very critical to cross-border cooperation. And of course it's instrumental, and that's been a big focus of the conversation over the last 18 months. A very small amount of concessional finance plays a really catalytic role in the provision of public goods, in the creation of new low carbon and climate resilient markets such as insurance or renewable energy. And that instrumental aspect matters much more for some countries, least developed countries, small nations like the small island developing states and so on. The symbolic and relational aspects are much more important when you're talking about a China, an India, a Brazil and so on, who see themselves as being deprived of development opportunities by the choices made by high income countries in the past. So I just want to take you to the exact language in the Copenhagen Accord where the 100 billion goal was agreed. So the $100 billion goal was set in 2009. And there's two things that I want to articulate about this. So the first one is, and we've had a lot of talk over the last couple of days about contracts for green bonds and how they're not reliable, and contracts for debt restructuring and the importance of detailed language and how little investors often know about what they're buying and its conditions. And I think this is the entire text around the 100 billion. I think you'll agree that the terms and conditions are not very detailed and explicit. And that has left a problem for the next 11 years to 2020 about how you measure, report, claim, attribute that $100 billion goal. It's also very striking because the Overton's window has shifted dramatically in that period. The so-called political sense of what this $100 billion goal might involve. When this was crafted, there was a very strong sense that most of this would be private finance and most of it would be loans. And now for those of you who follow the climate finance communities, there's very strong pressure for grant-based finance exclusively up to this $100 billion goal. And we've had a bit of a discussion about the role that different financing instruments play in driving change. The other thing I wanted to share about this is I thought you might be interested in the politics of how we landed on $100 billion, which is quite clearly a figure pulled out of the wind with no connection to any reality anywhere. The US basically showed up and said they were willing to provide $30 to $40 billion. And India, China, Brazil, and South Africa showed up and said, we will maybe accept 300 to 400 billion, but don't count on it. And that was the conversation between 2005 and 2008. Not very constructive. I've had that conversation in 3 seconds, and it basically stayed like that for 4 years. The key situation that broke this forward was actually that a developed country broke ranks. And specifically, Gordon Brown from the UK broke ranks. It was just after the first wave of the financial crisis when he personally had a huge amount of credibility in the international system. And he stepped forward and said, I can come up with a compromise number. And the compromise number was based on 2 things. First, it obviously had to be between the 30 to 40 billion proposed by the US and the 300 to 400 proposed by the basic countries. Though Gordon Brown strongly preferred it was closer to the US figure, as it is. And the second factor was that they basically did some back-of-the-envelope calculations in the Treasury about what the UK could plausibly see itself providing going forward. And that led him to put forward this number of 100 billion. And at the time, no one involved in the negotiations thought this was not possible. They thought we would hit 100 billion comfortably by 2016, and then thereafter that would hugely facilitate international cooperation and solidarity because of this gesture of good trust. And in fact, of course, last year's Glasgow climate discussions and this year's conversations in Sharm have in fact been poisoned by the very significant shortfall, not least since the 80 billion is as reported by developed countries, often with some very dubious counting, especially by Japan, to reach even the $80 billion figure. So that's some of the context for the 100 billion goal. So these are the key moments in the climate accords over the last 11 years since that was negotiated in terms of climate finance. So Copenhagen is when the $100 billion goal was agreed. It was reaffirmed in Paris alongside some confirmation of the financial mechanisms of the UN Climate Convention. In Katowice, coincidentally, a climate conversation held at the same time as a coal trade show in Poland, so that was fun. The decision was made there that the 100 billion a year by 2020 goal would apply between 2020 and 2025. And also there was a decision made that in 2025 a new goal would kick in, which would be negotiated from COP26 held in Glasgow up through to COP29, which is Australia is currently the only country that has put its name forward to host that. We have a strong run of climate villains, by the way, going forward. We have Egypt this year, the UAE next year, and Australia the year after that. So again, why COP27 is going to fail. But I think the important thing is that developed countries, and particularly the US, think about the climate finance conversation happening specifically against this 10-year backdrop and the perceived triumph in Copenhagen of coming up with a figure that North and South agreed on. And what I actually want to do is take you back to the place we were in 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol, because there's a much longer-term politics around the climate accords. It's largely been written off by the West and by high-income countries. And that has profoundly shaped the very, very bitter place we are in the climate finance negotiations today. So the Kyoto Protocol and the UN Climate Convention, which was developed 5 years earlier, 1992, proposed 3 categories of countries. Firstly, there were Annex I countries. Annex I countries comprises then OECD members, European Commission members, and so-called economies in transition, obviously Eastern Europe, Central Asia, former USSR nations. Annex II comprised those countries under the climate accords were expected to reduce emissions. And they were expected to reduce emissions in quite a top-down way. You know, X country had a responsibility to cut emissions by Y amount, and so on. There was a subset of those countries, Annex II countries, which comprised the OECD and European Commission members as they were then. Those countries had additional responsibilities. They were seen as both high emitters, like the economies in transition, but also with an ability to pay and to support developing countries with their transition. And so they had financial and technological and capacity responsibilities as well under the climate accords. And then there was everyone else, non-Annex 1, sorry. And so you walked out of 1997 with a bunch of countries that had promised to cut emissions and a bunch of countries that had no responsibility within the climate accords to cut emissions. And that was immediately problematic because maybe in 1992 you did have that distinction between Annex 1 and the rest, but it was already obvious that there would be a couple of countries that would be different, that there was an emerging economies coming up. And by 1997, with the rapid growth of China, it was already becoming very stark. And so you already started to see Annex 2 countries raising an eyebrow about why they had emission reduction responsibilities and financial responsibilities and China didn't. And that becomes a stumbling block for the next 15 years of climate negotiations. So fast forward to 2009, which was another failed COP, just like the one in 2 weeks. Let's have a look at why developed countries are frustrated. Here we have a bunch of the bigger Annex 2 countries, Annex 1 countries as well. Russia is Annex 1. And what you'll see is that these are all countries that have promised to cut emissions by maybe 20 to 25%, varying by the individual country, relative to 1990 levels. And you'll see that we have not done a very good job, quite frankly. The US is still above emissions levels where it was in 1990, as is Australia, Canada, Japan. Russia saw a sharp shock, but induced by economic conditions, not by policy. And the European Union has certainly started to show emission reductions and should be commended for that, but they are perhaps not of the scale that one would believe if you heard a lot of the EU messaging around their relative climate leadership. And that's partially because that is slightly concealed by the inclusion of the economies in transition, who only later came to these obligations, but it's certainly not a very, very stark reduction. So developing countries show up at Copenhagen and at Paris, and they're showing up in Egypt, mad, quite frankly, and I see why. For those of you who can't pick my accent, I know most people are here in their second language. I'm Australian, and we have been a real villain in the whole process. There's at least one Canadian in the room, and I think an American as well, and you are hanging out right with me. So we'll come to this in more detail in a moment. A Dutchman in Canada, own it. On the other hand, why are developed countries concerned, and why are they showing up in Copenhagen and in Paris expecting other responsibilities? And it's mostly a story of China, a little bit of India, but mostly a story of China. And you'll see that China's emissions have just soared particularly in the last 20 years. And that's why you have that situation combined with broader geopolitics of particularly the US Congress and Senate being unable to pass meaningful climate legislation unless the international system requires that China is also a part of the deal. And why you have so much intransigence, again, particularly but not exclusively in the US, about the idea of climate finance transfers, given that China does not have that obligation and has become an economic powerhouse and consequently a source of significant carbon emissions. I think personally that the most valuable way to look at this is to look at historical emissions. And I think that for 2 interrelated reasons. The first is that carbon dioxide emissions produced over the last 100 years remain in the atmosphere and continue to have a warming effect long after the year in which they're produced. And so we need to look at how much countries have produced over time to fully understand their impact on current rises in temperature. So that's your scientific reason. The second is your economic and social reason, which is that the construction of infrastructure entails embedded emissions. There are emissions involved in the construction of buildings, of roads, and so on. So quite apart from the emissions implied by the ongoing operating of, say, cars and power plants, there is a need in low and lower middle income countries in particular, as they try to provide shelter and infrastructure for their population, to have a certain quantity of emissions produced in that process. And so there's an equity reason as well to think about emissions in the long term, because countries that have a long history of emissions have had a lot of time and a lot of atmospheric space to construct that infrastructure stock. And so when we think about historical emissions, I think this figure is really helpful, especially when we factor it with population. So the one that stands out, the three that stand out here are the US, the EU, and China, very obviously. This is historical emissions since the industrial era. The US, you'll see up there, accounts for 25% of historical emissions since the industrial era. For context, the US accounts for 4% of the global population. So this is primarily a story about Americans, and of course not all Americans. It's a highly unequal society, but a relatively small proportion of Americans are gobbling up the carbon budget. The EU is almost as bad. It's a slightly larger share of emissions, of population, forgive me, and a slightly smaller share of emissions. But it is certainly, its share of the global carbon budget that is consumed is definitely vastly larger than its share of global population. And there is no doubt that China is very much present there, and we can see why the US has a bugbear about China in the Global Climate Accords. But China is 12.7% of historical anthropogenic emissions, and it's 17% of the world's population today. So if we were to assign the remaining carbon budget on the basis of population, we would have to say that China is entitled to more atmospheric space than it has used so far. Obviously, there are other countries that may need it more urgently, but I think it is very clear why some countries are held responsible for climate change when you factor in historical emissions and population. And that is the context against which climate finance is so symbolically important, even if it is a relatively small amount of money. So going on from the bigger picture of the 100 billion goal, I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about the practical realities of what climate finance looks like. There's a couple of people in the room I know who have actually been involved in managing climate finance in the past, so really looking forward to your comments and questions afterwards. But the main feature of climate finance architecture is that it has learned absolutely nothing from decades of development cooperation, and we collectively apologise for our gross ineptness in handling the funds. It looks fairly straightforward. You have developed countries responsible for providing 100 billion, and they disperse it through broadly 4 channels. Bilateral, EU is a major regional force, and it is a very, very generous provider of climate finance. The MDBs and the multilateral climate funds. So far, so good, but let's unpack it a bit further. And of course, what you've got is you've got 30 odd countries that individually have any number of individual windows, avenues for funding themselves, very varied terms and conditions. GIZ is the absolute worst. You have, again, the EU, you have the World Bank and 8 regional multilateral development banks, and you have at least 20 multilateral climate funds of various types, although the 3 that really matter are the GEF, the CIF, and the GCF at the bottom there. And so let's say that you're Samoa or Mozambique, and you are facing horrific cyclones and salination of your drinking water and rising sea levels, and what you want is support for a really coherent plan to, say, climate-proof your agriculture. Or you're Bangladesh or India or South Africa, and you're looking for a holistic approach to decarbonise your power system. What you're in fact faced with is this. All of whom profess to talk to each other but very rarely align. There's very, very limited, for example, coordinated donor reporting, nothing on the scale of what we see from, for example, the Paris Club in terms of coordination of a response. So again, developing countries are extremely frustrated with this system. So I'm just going to follow up on something that my colleague Shakira presented yesterday, which is just to underscore why the South Africa Just Energy Transition Partnership announced at COP26 was seen as such a breakthrough. Because, you know, the promise of 8.5 billion by a handful of G7 countries to South Africa might not seem like that big a deal in the scheme of things. But the reason it's such a big deal is twofold. Firstly, the deal does a very exceptional job of aligning national development priorities. South Africa's industry is collapsing in the absence of a reliable, affordable power system. It's also going to lose its competitiveness due to the extreme carbon intensity of its power system, as, for example, the EU and now the US think about introducing carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So South Africa urgently, to create jobs, to ameliorate poverty, to provide services, needs a way to change its energy system, and it needs to do so managing its coal miners, its degraded environmental areas, decommissioning its coal plants. On the global side, this is the first time you've had a number of bilateral donors come together with relatively flexible funding, responding to South Africa's proposed investment plan in a way that tackles multiple points in the energy transition at once. So that alignment of international and development in a very much country-led effort is seen as potentially a huge breakthrough. But at this point, it's just a political declaration and a contentious investment plan. So we're hanging a lot of hope on something reasonably small. I'm going to skip those because Shakira covered them, and I'm happy to share more if people are interested. So I've got two things left to cover today. One is why we fell short on the 100 billion, or where we fell short on the 100 billion. And the second is what is going to follow the 100 billion beyond possibly additional just energy transition partnerships like the one in South Africa. And keep your eyes peeled for one being announced with Vietnam at COP27. So we basically, as you saw before, the 100 billion goal is a collective goal. All developed countries are collectively held to account for delivering it or not delivering it. And that obviously creates a horrific free riders effect, whereby some countries have stepped up magnificently and some have not, and yet all have been regarded as falling short collectively. And so a couple of years ago, in response to that challenge, ODI published a paper which for the first time publicly, I think a number of countries behind the scenes have done their own analysis of what their fair share might look like, but we published the first public assessment of how much each country should be providing of that $100 billion goal. And we put forward 3 metrics. None of them are perfect. I'll be very upfront about that, but they're all relevant to the conversation. The first one is share of GDP out of the countries that are responsible for climate finance, indicating that, apologies, that should be ability to pay. It's got absolutely no correlation to willingness to pay. The second one, cumulative emissions, and I've already outlined why we think that's important, and that speaks to historical responsibility. And we added in population, just because one measure of equity that is often used in measuring the carbon budget and other things is assuming that every person living currently gets to receive an equal amount of the remaining carbon budget. And we said, well, let's say the same thing for climate finance. Let's say once you've graduated as a developed country, all citizens in that category have an equal responsibility. So all of them up for debate, and you can use any one of those metrics, but we put an equal weighting on the 3 of them. And here is your ranking of the 23 countries. So I think the first thing to say is that most Scandinavian countries did really well. Unfortunately, not so well the one we are in, but a big credit to Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and then a little bit lower down is Finland. Iceland did worse again, if that's any comfort. But the key point here, I think, is that you've got sort of 5 Northern European and Japan nations that really showed up to the 100 billion with style and with generosity. And then you've got a number of countries that come reasonably close. And the reason I'm trying to be quite generous to the yellow countries here is that our estimates on the amount of climate finance provided are conservative. There is appalling data on climate finance provision. So what we've used here in terms of the billions that have been provided, which in 2020, is based on climate finance reported to the OECD DAC. And of course, a number of countries firstly provided funding through the multilateral development banks, who then leveraged it, and the outflows of climate finance that you could attribute back were larger, but we haven't yet done that step in our analysis. And secondly, we haven't counted private finance mobilised because the latest data is 2018, and because, again, particularly Japan, very dubious reporting. But those are both developments we hope to do next year. But it does mean that the countries in yellow, if they went through a lot of the multilateral institutions with their climate finance, if they were very effective in leveraging private finance, they might make it into their fair share. But if you're orange or red, you almost certainly did not. And what the thing that I want you to focus on here, the share is very important, of course, but we all know that, you know, the Greeces, the Portugals, the Luxembourgs are not the ones that are going to break the bank or otherwise. This is overwhelmingly a story about the US. According to our calculations, the US, which accounts for over 50% of the emissions of developed countries, very close to 50% of the GDP of the developed countries, and about 30% of the population, if you average those, it should be providing about $43.5 billion out of the $100 billion a year. It did not. It provided $2.3 billion, so 5% of its fair share. You would not necessarily know this from the media coverage in the lead up to COP, where there was a lot of coverage about Biden's bold new pledge, where by 2025, America would be providing 11 billion, which brings them up to 26% of their fair share and is therefore not at all worth all the hype. The 11.6 billion number was chosen because the second biggest commitment is Japan at 11.5 billion. Japan's economy is a quarter the size of the US's. So the US is about being the biggest, but not at all about being the fairest, and I think no one is surprised by that. The other few that are really notable to mention are Australia and Canada, both of which fell short by about 2 to 3 billion, a very substantial share when you consider that the shortfall was 20 billion. Also worth noting that all three of those economies are highly carbon intensive. The US is the biggest producer of oil and gas in the world, which explains why the last COP was a coal COP and not an oil and gas COP. And then from the EU, you also have Italy and Spain falling significantly short. And I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there about how the treatment of the EU collectively in these figures, because the EU negotiators that we work with on this topic are not interested in whether Italy and Spain fall short. They want to know EU totals and how the EU compares with the US. And so you have a very clear willingness from some countries to subsidise others so that the EU collectively reaches what it perceives to be its fair share. And that is a very pretty version of this, really hammering home that the US is evil on climate. So as of 2020, the US provided less climate finance than any of those four countries, but that is a quick comparison of its economic size relative to those four nations. So some really very, very shocking figures there. The other thing that we put forward was we wanted to look at which additional countries should be providing climate finance. And the reason for this is that the list of countries that should be providing climate finance has not formally been updated in the climate accords. I talked before about this list of Annex 1, Annex 2 and non-Annex 1 countries. We have no updates on those figures. What you have seen instead is that from Copenhagen, the climate accords stopped using the language of annexes and they start talking about the language of developed versus developing countries with their respective responsibilities. But it's not defined which countries are developed and which countries are developing. There's no clear list like there is for the annexes. And so what that has meant is that a number of countries, particularly South Korea and Eastern European countries, have nominated themselves as developed. They have stepped up on climate finance and technology transfer, and they have taken on bolder emission reduction targets. And a number of countries that arguably should have not chosen to do so. And we wanted to lay this quite bare. And so what we did, we basically used the same two metrics I've talked about, cumulative emissions and per capita gross national income, as proxies of historical responsibility and ability to pay. And rather than set a hard limit, we just benchmarked against the countries that are required under the climate accords to pay climate finance. And I find it really interesting because 7 countries show up as very clear candidates for doing so. Singapore, Qatar, and Israel, to my mind, are just no-brainers. They all have incomes and emissions per person higher than at least 5 other so-called Annex 2 countries. And then perhaps you can also argue that Brunei, Kuwait, South Korea, and the UAE should also be a part of that list. Not quite as wealthy, but equally carbon intensive. And in this row across the bottom, you've got lots of small island states, oil exporters, and former USSR countries, which for various reasons, location, colonial history, relatively low cost of energy at home, have all got very high emissions, but relatively low ability to pay. And so there's a story, there's a real story there about what it means equitably to both to take on responsibility for emission reductions and to provide climate finance. The countries in blue, by the way, are ones that are already providing climate finance, either bilaterally through the multilateral climate funds or through their contributions to the European Union budget. They're often very small amounts of climate finance. Qatar provided $500,000 last year to the Adaptation Fund, which is not its fair share, but it still was the first non-Annex 2 country to provide finance to that fund, so very welcome. I'm over time, Kunal. Can I go through 1 or 2 more things? Or you can...
Absolutely, yes. Thanks.
So I wanted to talk about 2 things that I think are coming next. So the first is ODI is in the very privileged position of supporting 2 separate blocks in negotiations about the new collective quantified goal, which will replace the $100 billion target from 2025. Some of my colleagues support the Alliance of Small Island States in the negotiations, and my team have the privilege of supporting Germany and therefore the EU in the negotiations. And the main aspiration in both of those two groups is to have a goal that has much more potential for accountability and transparency than the $100 billion goal currently has. But different groups are advocating for lots of different things. The main point that I wanted to make, which picks up on, again, a lot of the conversations we had yesterday, is about this fundamental tension between financing adaptation and financing mitigation. Adaptation is mostly a story of local public goods and serving the poorest, who are also the most vulnerable, for the most part. There's obviously also a factor of exposure to risks. You can be an upper middle income country, but if you're a SIDS, there's a chance you're getting a pretty severe cyclone every few years, but mostly poverty corresponds to vulnerability. But then with mitigation, it's a different story. Mitigation is an arena where grants are not necessarily the most effective way to drive the changes in the real economy that we need to see for emission reductions. And I think there's a need for much more creative use of a wide range of instruments so that what remains relatively small amounts of concessional finance can be used to drive that change. And so there's a role for concessional loans, mediated by the consideration of the high indebtedness that we've talked about so much over the last day and a half. There's a role to think about guarantees and a role to think about equity and so on, so that we can really drive those systemic changes. And you don't hear much of that from civil society at the moment around the COP. You basically hear that we need, and also for that matter from most of the G77, it's a story about grants. And I think there's a nuanced narrative that needs to be landed there about having reporting on climate finance that reflects the true fiscal value from the countries providing it, but then recognising that that money should be used creatively to maximise the real world impact, at least on the mitigation side. The second thing I wanted to do, just because I didn't want to only have men in my presentation, is I wanted to talk about very briefly about a new initiative that I think some of you may be already aware of, the Bridgetown Initiative. And the Bridgetown Initiative is a relatively new movement that really kicked off in July at a meeting in Bridgetown in Barbados, hosted by Mia Motley, which is basically looking at the finances that her country faced as an upper middle income country, but also one in high debt distress and very high climate vulnerability, and looking at the impossibility of a robust fiscal system under those conditions, and thinking through some of the reforms that had to happen to the international financial architecture to adjust to a post-pandemic, climate-changed world. And she co-hosted it with Amina Mohammed from the UN Deputy Secretary General. And there's been, you might have seen some coverage of it. I know many of you were at the annual IMF World Bank meetings, so you might have seen some coverage there. But there's basically a push to think through what are the immediate reforms to the MDBs and the IMF that can provide emergency relief to countries. And I think a lot of you are a part of those conversations, even if it's not always done with the kind of hat of the Bridgetown Initiative. The interesting part about the Bridgetown Initiative is it's trying to have a conversation over 3 to 5 years, which really brings your community and my community together much more systematically to think about how a 3-degree world is going to impact on the financial system and the types of support we have. Very early days, a lot of sort of very preliminary conversations about, for example, the IMF Sustainability and Resilience Trust, or the role of the MDB capital adequacy frameworks, and how they can be adjusted. But I think a really exciting place for us to bring the collective firepower in this room over the next little while. And this will start to come up in the climate finance arena much more strongly, because in the end, 100 billion is really nothing. And this is the space where the conversations about climate smart development are going to have to happen. Thank you for letting me go over time. And I look forward to your questions.
Sorry, use the chair. Yeah. No, we do have. Oh, no. Yeah, okay.
Do I just pop it out? Yep.
Thank you, Sarah. It was a really fascinating lecture. I thought there were 3 key takeaways from my point of view, and there must be for others too, other takeaways. The first is the takeaway, the politics of the 100 billion. That itself is fascinating, really, how the number was arrived at. The second takeaway is the fact that there's such an unequal distribution of who's contributing to climate finance, especially the low share of the US in actuals compared to its fair share. That was quite striking. And I think that's the number that you have in your work. It should really be out in the media much more clearly, especially if you go to COP27. And the third takeaway is the fragmented nature of climate finance, exactly as you've seen with development cooperation in the past, and maybe even currently. So that's also something that was striking to me. So I think let's have some time. We have actually about 20-25 minutes for Q&A. Let's have probably 2 questions at one go, and then is that okay? Yeah. And then we can see if we can have more. So go ahead. I mean, who's going to provide the first couple of questions? Arjan first. Yep. But no, well, I think I saw your hand go up first. Yeah, go ahead.
But happy to try to get us started. Thank you so much. This is I hate the fact that I'm afraid that I agree with you on COP that this is not working. The 2 questions I have are on the first is on that fragmentation. For me, that's also, and I really like that. The way you presented that, but at the same time, I think like when this was announced, I Canadian what used to be CEDA, but what they need to do is integrate that new commitment into current programming. It would have been so maybe Environment Canada could play a bigger role, and I think they do, but that would be even worse for the fragmentation. I think we know that. So I don't actually see an alternative to that, and in a way, it's like I never. To be honest, never quite understood how you can have that global climate commitment independent of the ODA commitment. That had to be connected, and now we see how that happens. And part of that, it becomes not traceable anymore because you can't actually. It's so hard to figure out what the new commitments are. So climate has to be part of development. I think that's the only thing that can come out. Climate needs to be integrated in development. Anyway, if you can comment on that. The second one is I 100% agree that the symbolic value of having this, if it has to have any value, then it needs to be some form of a grant, right? And you say the 100 billion should be primarily grant and should be primarily LDC adaptation, right? That would be very clear. At the same time, wouldn't that then undermine the need to leverage the other? What is it? The total number is like 90, like multiple times more than that, right? And I still say like the idea that money would need to leverage private money, but for that you need to have some form of blended finance. I'm not looking at the specificities of how you define that, right? So also like you perhaps comment a little bit more on why you apart from the symbolic value, how do you think that the emphasis on grants, how that works in that broader context? Thank you, great presentation.
Thanks, Arjan. More questions? Anthony? And then Amit later. I'll come back to you later. Yeah. Thanks.
I just got to add one more level of fragmentation. Because you described the 15 players in a way. I will take it one step further and say below that we have the actual players. So when it comes to who is investing, who is selecting projects, there is a huge fragmentation problem and overlapping and duplication. For example, standards, due diligence, probability of default, you can name it, a whole list of things that people keep repeating one after the other. So I would say that, for practical reasons, this level of fragmentation needs to be introduced in the debate because it's very important.
Thanks, Anthony. Sarah, you want to take those 2 questions?
Thank you both. Really good questions, and I see that the concerns about fragmentation have struck a chord very strongly. So I agree with you, Arjan, on the inevitability of the fragmentation, if you will. I think not at all because there's an economic or logic to it, and from the perspectives of developing countries, a political logic, but you can see the political logic at home. For example, Canada has a feminist international policy, and so it's going to have a series of grants and loans based on gender and climate, whereas the UK is interested in green finance and greening trade, and so there's always going to be this domestic imperative there. I think what I would highlight is that there are some really good success stories here. within that fragmented architecture, and a few real car crashes. So the car crash is the Green Climate Fund, and it was designed that way. The Green Climate Fund is a financial mechanism of the UN Climate Convention. They had a choice at its inception about whether it would be programmatic finance or project-based finance, and they opted for project-based finance. And so you have ended up with a situation that has very high transaction costs for various reasons, and not a huge amount of strategic alignment with countries' development goals. Often the vast majority of funding going through another layer of fragmentation, Anthony, often dispersed to the MDBs, to the UN agencies, and so on. But the success stories notably would include the GCF's counterpart, the climate investment funds. That was set up in parallel because there were concerns that there wouldn't be agreement on a UN financial mechanism under the Climate Convention. So it was set up by the 8 multilateral development banks working together. And they really have some wonderful stories about driving whole system change earlier. So supporting DFIs and commercial banks in Turkey to scale energy efficiency and small-scale renewable products. They've completely transformed over 5 years, built up this very, very deep market of lease systems, loan systems, SMEs, very active in that space. And the South Africa Just Energy Transition Partnership promises to do the same, you know. That would be, for the UK share of that is supposed to be about 1.5 billion, I think. That's several years, as a big share of the next few years of climate finance for the UK. And it implies that it's doing it in a much more systematic manner going forward. If you get that kind of deal with 3 or 4 more emerging economies, then you have started to see a real shift in the architecture. The one part I would push back on, however, Arjan, is your point about aligning climate and development. Personally, my instinct is absolutely with you. I think we should be thinking about low carbon and climate resilient development. But I have some very, you can say either rich or frustrating conversations with my own colleagues at ODI who basically see that there's trade-offs between one or the other. They say you can either have economic growth or you can act on climate. You can either have industry or you can be low carbon. This is a crude characterization, of course. But I think that there has, certainly in the early days of climate finance, to some extent you couldn't have aligned the two because there was too much risk that from developing countries or traditional development actors, it might have been seen as climate options happening at the expense of development. It had to be seen as new and additional for a while. I think that narrative has moved on, and I think that narrative has moved on partially because the economics has changed. Solar and wind are wildly competitive now, and it makes sense for most countries, and so that has changed. I hope that addresses your point as well, partially, Anthony, which I wholly agree with. So the second point, with the new collective quantified goal. So the consensus with the $100 billion target and the new collective quantified goal is that there should be a balance of mitigation and adaptation finance. And that's actually been written now into the Paris Agreement and Katowice and others, which it wasn't, as you'll have seen, in Copenhagen. And my personal recommendation here, with no backing from anybody, is what I was hoping to say was that I think that the volume of money as measured as the grant equivalent should be balanced for each one. But then the adaptation finance should be dispersed as grants or something very highly concessional. Whereas the mitigation finance, while we might measure its grant-based equivalent, which we do for development assistance and we don't do for climate finance, then that money could be leveraged at scale. And so for comparison, just for interest's sake, when I put up that fair share ranking, that is the value reported by countries to the OECD, but doesn't actually reflect grant equivalent. And so France and Japan made it into my top 6, but actually both of them provided 80% loans. Whereas Denmark, UK, Australia, which is right down the bottom, they all provided 100% grants. And so the system, and the Copenhagen Accord permits that, but the system of truly capturing the contribution a country makes is not always accurate. And I think that has just changed in 2020 in the OECD DAC system, but it hasn't trickled through yet into that. We haven't got the latest numbers, basically, which reflect that change. But I think you'll see Japan and France drop down very dramatically.
So I saw a question from Amir, and I was also going to ask a question to see some more from the audience. But Amir, go ahead.
Thanks, for that presentation. So I'm Amir Lebedioui, so at the University of London. So given that you've, with your perspectives on the politics of climate finance, I was wondering, what do you think are the possible risks of conditionalities attached to this type of climate financing based on industrial or strategic interests? For example, Denmark providing a grant, right, for renewables deployment, but it has to be Vestas wind turbines, or the US providing, grants, but for anything that is not a Chinese-made solar cell. So do you see this happening? Is it possible with the current regulatory framework? Yeah. Thanks.
So Sarah, my question is back to the politics of the 100 billion. So how do you think that's been affected by this the Ukraine crisis and the big increase in energy prices? At one level, you could say that there's an increasing need, especially the EU and the UK, of a shift away from non-renewable energy towards renewable energy, importance of having energy security. At another level, the Ukraine crisis also has led to a situation of public finances in many of the EU countries going and the UK taking a turn for the worse, along with the shifts in the political space on countries where we have governments coming in who are less aligned towards the climate change goals. So how does the politics of 100 billion change given what's going on right now in the energy price situation? That's my question. So 2 questions. Yeah.
It's not a small question, Kunal. So Amir, I don't think I've got a strong answer to your question. I actually think a number of other people in the room are better placed to speak about that, because I think some of the risks are the same. And we should be learning a lot more from development than we have about the risks of, these very nebulous goals, poverty reduction and climate smart development. It really depends on what indicators you choose and so on. And there's a lot of scope to fudge data or choose problematic indicators. I think there is obviously a really important role for the 100 billion, but there is also accountability to taxpayers. So there is a need for conditionalities, but there is a need to design them in a way that genuinely allows a climate-aligned form of development rather than the imposition that you have to buy US solar panels, even if they're more expensive, So would really welcome sort of thoughts on that immediately or over coffee. So I think the Ukraine... I think actually there have been 3 things that have really, one of which is the Ukraine crisis, that have really thrown into stark relief the kind of paltriness of the OECD countries' response to the climate crisis with the 100 billion. So the first is the fiscal stimulus package of 2008 to 2011, which absolutely dwarfed climate finance. The second is the fiscal response to the pandemic. And then the third is the Ukraine crisis. And that was the last of those. The developed countries were particularly incensed in the case of the US. And I know this seems like a real American bashing session, but they're really bad. Because, the US owes 40 billion of climate finance, and it took them about 2 weeks to turn around a 40 billion commitment for Ukraine. And that's one country. And, the other G76 are outraged with a degree of being understandable. I think I'm going to answer a slightly different but I think related question. I think it is really interesting to see the impact that the Ukraine crisis will have on global energy systems going forward. So there has been one of the reasons that this COP is going to fail is that there is a very widespread, partially true perception that the North has for a long time demanded that developing countries make sacrifices for climate action. Whereas they already achieved a high standard of life and can now slowly decarbonise at a rate that still consumes most of the remaining carbon budget. And yet, when Ukraine got, in the face of this threat from the east, Germany turned back on its coal-fired power plants, and Europe scrambled for gas and encouraged Senegal and Qatar and Australia to open up new gas fields. The UK issued 100 new licenses for oil and gas in the North Sea. The Biden administration, while launching the fantastic Inflation Reduction Act, also opened up a huge amount of public land for fossil fuel extraction. And so there is a partially legitimate perception that the West is hypocritical in how important climate is relative to crises that happen at home versus crises that happen in the South. And I would try and nuance that in a couple of ways. The first thing to say is that I think for most high-income countries, for most developed countries, and I'm differentiating here because high income includes, say, the Kuwaits or Singapore's that don't have obligations necessarily under the climate accords. So that I think there are some developed countries that are going to see a temporary spike in emissions, but mostly they are accelerating decarbonisation. So Germany is opening its coal plants for 2 winters again, but it is also pouring money into energy efficiency, into scaling its renewables and so on. The US is as terrible as it has been, and it is opening up public land. But the Inflation Reduction Act has $369 billion to build green American industries at home, and that will change the landscape of business lobbying and of energy markets within the US permanently. And there's pros and cons to this. You know, it's very much, we talked yesterday about rising protectionism. You know, you've got an EU, a US, and a China green technology hub, not necessarily standardization happening, but the US investment there will permanently shift the US onto a lower carbon path. But you've got a number of other countries that have absolutely seen this as an excuse to buckle down on fossil fuels, including my own. And then some countries that have been good, like the UK, have under our recent flurry of prime ministers, has seen this as an opportunity to issue new oil and gas licenses, to run over climate protesters on the highway, etc., etc. Really positive place to be right now. 10 out of 10 would recommend. The good news is that the International Energy Agency just published its World Economic Outlook yesterday. I'd really recommend reading the executive summary. It's just a really great glimpse into pathways ahead of us. And for the first time ever, they forecast a peak to all kinds of fossil fuels. Not as soon as it needs to be for 1.5 degrees, but it puts us on a path to 2.5 degrees. And it was less than 10 years ago that we were on a path to sort of 4+ degrees, which really is kind of a apocalyptic future. And that is very much due to the US Inflation Reduction Act, the EU Green Deal, and then the additional scramble incurred by the Ukraine crisis. So it's a real tragedy that this acceleration had to happen on the backs of the Ukrainians. But from a climate perspective in the next few years, it has certainly injected a lot of momentum.
Right, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. More questions for the audience? Marty, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And not really questions, two sort of suggestions, recommendations. I mean, while the 100 billion was agreed in 2009, there hasn't been much of inflation since then. Now there is. So it should be sort of be updated in terms of its real value. Second, I suppose not many of you know that there's a climate coalition of finance ministers. Okay, Sarah knows this. And there's 79 countries, and they are responsible for 66% of GDP, global GDP. And it includes the US. But it also includes many African countries, South American countries, and Asian countries. And I just have the website of that in front of me, and it has these principles, which are called Helsinki principles, because they were agreed in Helsinki. And the 5th principle is mobilize climate finance. I mean, I would suggest that you would sort of contact them and say that, could you share with your members the information that you provided? And because that's, I mean, they are at the end the persons responsible for providing the finance, and they should be made aware of the obligations that they have.
Thank you, Marty. Any final questions? We have about 4 minutes left. Anyone else? Okay, so Sarah. Last few comments, yes.
Thanks, Martin. So I guess I'll answer the easy comment there first. If you have the contact details for the Sherpa for the Coalition of Finance Ministers, I'm super happy to have a chat. Shutting me off is the hard part, you can probably guess. The second part with the 100 billion, you're 100% right about inflation. I think the first thing, I think there's a 2-part response, neither of which fundamentally addresses the question of inflation, but is of interest. The first thing is that the climate vulnerable countries, which is a bloc of about 53 nations that have opted into this informal coalition in the climate accords, have proposed that given that developed countries have fallen short on the 100 billion goal for the first 3 years, that instead they should set themselves a target of 600 billion between 2020 and 2025. And so the expectation is that they make it up in the last few years. Hasn't gained any traction yet. I will also talk to the Coalition of Finance Ministers about that. But just so you know that I think is, you will by de facto see an increase if that should come through, although it still falls short of what they've committed to when you take inflation into account. The second point is just for interest. There are no official numbers currently being talked about in the space of the new collective quantified goal, the one that will kick in from 2025. But there are 3 or 4 submissions coming forward from the negotiating blocks, or publications coming forward from the negotiating blocks. I think one of them was published last week and the other 2 are forthcoming next week. And they're all starting to benchmark the new collective quantified goal at the $1 trillion mark. There has been no response from any developed nation to that figure, but just so you know, those are the kind of numbers that are being put on the table at the moment. I certainly think that there's going to be a lot more rigour to questions about leverage ratios, grant equivalence, concessionality, etc., if that kind of number is floated around. And I just wanted to take 1 second, because we've ended up on a slide that we didn't talk about. I opened up by talking about Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, this point about all finance flows being aligned with climate goals. And 2 points I wanted to make there. The first is that I think there needs to be much more thinking about the role that 100 billion or 1 trillion plays in helping to shift other flows. And I wanted to put that particularly on the table to this audience, because you are starting to see some really interesting work coming out from finance ministries and from central banks all over the world about climate proofing and climate aligning your spending and investment, public spending and investment, but also your financial regulation. And I think the Bank of Finland is one of the leaders on thinking about that, alongside the Dutch and British and French central banks. But we do a lot of work, for example, with the Reserve Bank of India, and you've really got a huge amount of scope, if you think about climate risks at this point in development, to shift the whole economy to something a bit more resilient and a bit more lower carbon. And the second thing that I wanted to say is that ODI a few years ago, and I can be very proud of this because I had absolutely nothing to do with it, put forward this model basically on how you can operationalize Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. And it basically picks out these 4 categories where you need to think through what your set of instruments looks like from the perspective of a range of government ministries. And over the last few years, we've worked with 10 countries, overwhelmingly SIDS, but also Germany, Indonesia, Colombia, to start setting a benchmark for the first global stocktake on how climate consistent countries currently are. And it's fascinating because, if you work with a Switzerland, it's a story about how you finance a huge proportion of the world's development from the Alps. And if you work with a Rwanda, it's basically a story about how you very slightly tweak agriculture spending. But just to say, we would be really delighted to work with some of you in Finland and look at what that looks like over the next couple of years, because I think this is something that's coming towards us like a truck over the next little while, and we have all the people in the room that we would need to do this really well. So I will call you once I've spoken to the Coalition of Finance Ministers. Thank you.
Thanks. So Sarah, thank you so much. Actually, at the end, I think we can be a little bit more positive after perhaps some negative views about the way the 100 billion was going, because you the example, the South African example, which was a great example of how countries which are going through this very challenging just transition can be where different partners can get together, think it through. I thought it was a really nice example. I think the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, has the promise that you mentioned. It has in the respect of climate financing was also very useful, and of course the EU Green Climate Funds and so on. So there are some positives. So maybe we should be a little bit more optimistic with COP27 than otherwise. So we're going to come to the end of this conference with some closing remarks by Tony Addison, who's been given this very difficult task of summarizing this day and a half in around 15 minutes or less. And then after that, Ika Korhonen, the director of BOFIT, is going to give a vote of thanks on behalf of both BOFIT and WIDER after Tony finishes. Tony, over to you. Yeah. You want to come to this? Yeah.
and it's always best to have the microphone on when you say that. I couldn't possibly summarize everything that we've said, so I'm going to give you some reflections in 10 minutes before we turn over to Kunal and Ilka to thank everybody. And the way that I've sort of thought about this is going back to the issue of what faces, say, a minister or finance minister in a country. And basically you can think that successful countries maintain a focus on a long-term development vision, including climate. They maintain that focus over time despite all of the economic shocks that come along. So economic shocks and political shocks and other types of shock, including now climate shocks, are part of life. But the countries that progress in terms of economic growth and poverty reduction and social improvement are in some ways the countries that, despite all that noise, maintain a rising trend. But of course, it's the shocks that throw policy off course, that lead policymakers to engage in firefighting, including one of the issues that we've discussed here at this meeting around debt in all of its various forms. And of course, developing country policymakers have often the least ability to focus on the rising trend and long-term vision in the face of shocks because of the structural weaknesses of their economies and their less ample fiscal space. So there's a great American philosopher who summed all of this up, Mike Tyson, the boxer. And Mike basically said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Right? That was Tyson's approach. And in some ways, that's what we see in our development discussions in this meeting, but the discussions that are going on all over the world as we come up to COP. We all have these great visions, we all have these great plans. We wanted to build back better after COVID. We wanted to achieve a just transition. We want to leave nobody behind. And these are all great visions. But what we have is a hesitant post-COVID recovery, notably in China, where the issue is not resolved. And what matters in China, of course, matters for the rest of the world, particularly the developing world, through commodity prices, trade, and finance. We have this terrible war in Ukraine, which is now associated with a geopolitical fragmentation, which impedes international action and coordination. So history is certainly not ended. And we have global inflation and a tightening capital market, which in turn reduces some of the possibilities of finance that we have available. So those are sort of the Mike Tyson punches to the global economy and the global vision. We've said a lot in this meeting about tightening global credit markets associated with rising rates, increasing spreads between developing country debt and advanced economy debt, capital markets drying up for probably at least half of the developing world. And if you've got dollar-denominated floating rate debt, you are in a very vulnerable position as a result of dollar appreciation. And we don't really know how far the dollar will appreciate because it's still an unresolved question as to how far the Federal Reserve will tighten in the face of rising US inflation. And so all of this amounts to a decrease in fiscal space, including for domestic climate adaptation and mitigation. And that's pretty hard because, as we've just heard in the very thorough and illuminating last presentation, international action on climate finance remains a very weak and disappointing response. And so this is where the two big themes of this conference have come together: debt associated with finance on one side and climate finance and climate change on the other, and has given us the context for our very rich and illuminating discussions over the last 2 days. So there's much to be pessimistic about. I come from the north of England, so we're sort of predisposed to be pessimistic in the north of England. But I like to say that we're sort of cheerfully grumpy. And the world, has been in this situation before and managed to crawl out of it. We had the 1980s debt crises, which were eventually resolved in a very messy way, but they were resolved. We had the Asian financial crisis in '98, which looked calamitous at the time, and we didn't know how far contagion would spread. We had the global financial crisis in 2009-10, and again, we didn't know how severe the shock would be, particularly to the developing world. But again, we managed to emerge from that, perhaps in not the best ways possible, but the global economy did come out of that. And then finally, we've had COVID, which, although, as I said, is unresolved in China, we've had the magnificence of science, which has delivered these vaccines, which has enabled us, through a global public good, to be present physically in this meeting today, rather than engaging with it on Zoom. So the conference has given us actual grounds for optimism, despite this pessimism. We've had some great ideas over our 2 days about how to try and sustain and build that longer-term development vision despite the shocks, to keep focused on climate, on poverty, on social improvement, despite the day-to-day business of finding the dollars for debt service, for fiscal consolidation, for whatever society also needs to do. So there is some ground for optimism for our Minister of Finance, despite the day-to-day difficulties of life, particularly in the developing world. We've had ideas around greening capital markets, particularly the very rich discussion around green bonds, the conversion of perhaps debt into equity for investment of venture capital, and not just a reliance on bond finance. We've had discussion around the rise of economic, social, and governance impact investing, ESG, which can now take advantage of that development vision to bring private capital alongside official development finance, and official development finance is often trying to leverage private capital in ways that really do build and invest in that long-term vision. We've had some excellent ideas around development banks, the role of national development banks, a greater priority to those development banks in supporting the greening of economic strategy, of supporting a green or sustainable industrial policy and the investments associated with it. And we've had some particularly interesting ideas about what the fintech revolution might mean in the developing world, which gives us possibilities of achieving financial inclusion that we could never have dreamed about even, say, 10 years ago. So we're starting to move on the finance and poverty agenda in ways that are really, truly imaginative and creative. So there's been much in this meeting to actually be optimistic about in terms of the generation of ideas. And I think this is the final note that I want to end on, which is to come back to Maureen from the Central Bank of Kenya, who made that very apt remark in response to my very difficult question about what one should do in situations like this, by emphasizing the enormous resilience of people in the developing world, especially in Africa, their creativity in finding solutions in very different and difficult circumstances, their ability to pull together and to pull out of crises, despite often very meager resources, and to find solutions in what is a very tough world. And I think, we can say modestly in this room over the last 2 days that the creativity of the people assembled coming from all kinds of different perspectives and backgrounds, has at least provided ideas and initiatives that we can now take forward into larger forums such as the COP meetings about to start, into further meetings of international finance ministers, into the UN system itself, so that we can make progress in ways that we would all think would be apt and fitting for the modern world. So that basically is my conclusion from the meeting, and I'd like to ask Kunal and Ilkka to make a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony. And me and Kunal decided to sort of share the responsibilities, so that I will say the final thanks for, first of all of you who came here, all the participants, everybody who presented, discussed. I mean, I learned so much during these 2 days. The discussions have been excellent. Of course, all the people sort of somewhere there who are watching. I think there have been several people watching yesterday and today, so that is quite nice. And then finally, I would like to thank the people who sort of made things actually happen. So on the wider side, Eva Nysönen and Team Ship, Jutta Stenholm, very much appreciated your sort of hard work during the conference, the wider travel team, and here at the Bank of Finland, Juliette Huttu from our communications unit, who's perhaps somewhere sort of looking at the stream, and Riikka Virtanen here, who's been sort of keeping tabs on everything and everybody during the discussions. And of course, then the team from Streamia, who have sort of worked to make everything happen and visible. And I looked at at least Bank of Finland YouTube channel yesterday evening, and there were something like 150 people who had been watching the stream, and I'm sure that there will be more people today. So thank you very much, everybody, and I think that is it. Thank you so much. Thanks.